Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently onto the dusty medieval roads of Europe, where millions of pilgrims once walked barefoot and weary toward the western edge of the known world, seeking miracles at the tomb of St. James in distant Galicia. Long before borders were drawn, before nations were named, before the modern world forgot what it meant to walk for months with nothing but faith and a scallop shell pinned to your cloak. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through vanished worlds that time tried to erase but couldn't quite forget. We walk alongside peasants who left their fields, nobles who abandoned their estates, merchants who saw opportunity and devotion, and sinners who sought forgiveness, on roads that stretched across mountains and rivers and kingdoms at war. We stand in monastery courtyards where exhausted travellers once collapsed after 20 miles of walking, where monks offered bread and shelter and stories of those who came before. We imagine the sound of wooden staffs striking cobblestones, the sight of cathedral spires appearing on distant horizons, the feeling of blistered feet carrying bodies forward, day after day towards something holy they could barely name but desperately needed. Each episode here isn't just about dates and ruins. It's about the lives lived, the steps taken, the prayers whispered in the dark, the transformations that happened not at the destination, but somewhere along the endless road between leaving and arriving. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. Europe in the 11th century was not the Europe we imagine when we think of grand cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts and the ordered certainty of medieval Christendom. It was rougher than that, darker, more uncertain. It was a patchwork of small kingdoms constantly at war, of villages clustered around wooden churches, of forests so deep and vast they seemed endless, of roads that were barely roads at all but mud tracks winding through wilderness, where bandits hid and wolves hunted, and travellers disappeared without explanation or memory. The people who lived in this world knew fear intimately. They feared starvation when harvests failed, feared disease that swept through villages like wildfire, feared the violence of lords who treated peasants as property, feared the eternal damnation their priests promised awaited sinners in the afterlife. Heaven and hell were not abstractions debated by theologians in distant universities. They were real places, as real as the village square, as real as the Lord's castle on the hill, and the question of where your soul would spend eternity was the most pressing question anyone could ask. The Church offered answers, but they came with conditions. Salvation required penance, sacrifice, proof of devotion that went beyond simply attending Mass on Sundays or muttering prayers before bed. The truly faithful needed to do more, to suffer more, to demonstrate through action that they deserved God's mercy. And so the concept of pilgrimage took root in the medieval mind. The idea that walking great distances to visit holy sites could earn forgiveness, could erase sins, could buy your way into paradise through blistered feet and aching legs and months away from everything you knew. There were already pilgrimage sites scattered across Europe. Jerusalem, of course, where Christ himself had walked and died and risen again, though reaching it meant crossing hostile territories and risking death a dozen different ways. Rome, where St. Peter and St. Paul were buried, where the Pope resided in his marble halls, where the grandeur of the ancient empire still whispered through crumbling arches and weathered columns. But for most people, for peasants who could never afford the journey to Jerusalem or even to Rome, for those whose bodies were too weak or whose obligations kept them close to home, these great pilgrimages remained impossible dreams. And then, in the far northwestern corner of Spain, in a region called Galicia that marked the edge of the Christian world where land ended and the vast Atlantic began, something was discovered that would change everything. Something that would create a new pilgrimage site, a third great destination to rival Jerusalem and Rome, something that would draw millions of feet onto roads that led west, always west, toward the setting sun and the tomb of an apostle who supposedly lay buried in Spanish soil 1700 years after his death. The discovery happened not through careful archaeological excavation, but through vision and miracle and the kind of convenient revelation that medieval people accepted as proof of divine intervention. A hermit named Pelagius, living alone in the Galician hills in the early 9th century, saw strange lights in the night sky, stars that seemed to fall and hover over a particular spot in the forest. He told the local bishop, a man named Theodomir, who investigated and found, beneath earth and brambles, ancient stone ruins, and inside them a tomb containing 3 bodies. The bishop declared, with a certainty that allowed no doubt, that these were the remains of St. James the Greater, one of Christ's 12 apostles, along with 2 of his disciples. Never mind that James had been executed in Jerusalem in the year 44, and that no historical record suggested his body had ever travelled to Spain. Never mind that the logistics of transporting a corpse across the Mediterranean to the furthest edge of the Roman Empire seemed improbable at best. The bishop said it was James. The local king Alfonso II endorsed the claim, and within decades pilgrims began arriving at what would become Santiago de Compostela, the Field of Stars, named for those miraculous lights Pelagius had witnessed. By the time the 11th century arrived, 200 years after that discovery, the pilgrimage had grown from a trickle of local devotees into a flood of travellers from across Europe. Kings built roads to accommodate them. Monasteries established hospices to shelter them. Towns sprouted along the route to feed them and house them and sell them the supplies they needed. The Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, became more than a pilgrimage path. It became a highway of faith and commerce and culture, connecting kingdoms that had little else in common, creating a shared European identity built on the simple act of walking west. The pilgrims themselves came from every level of medieval society. There were nobles doing penance for sins real or imagined, their fine clothes deliberately replaced with simple pilgrim garb to show humility. There were peasants hoping for miracle cures for illness or injury, carrying sick children or dragging crippled limbs, convinced that reaching Santiago would earn divine healing. There were criminals sentenced by courts to make the pilgrimage instead of facing execution or imprisonment, their crimes ranging from theft to murder. There were merchants who used pilgrimage as cover for trade, their packs heavy with goods to sell along the way. There were monks and nuns, scholars and artists, the curious and the desperate and the genuinely faithful, all walking the same roads toward the same destination. And the journey was not easy. It could take months, sometimes half a year or more, depending on where you started. You walked 20 or 30 miles a day if you were strong and the weather cooperated, less if mountains blocked your path or rivers ran too high to ford safely. You slept in monastery hospices when you could find them, in barns or forests when you couldn't. You ate whatever was available, bread and cheese if you were lucky, wild herbs and stream water if you weren't. You walked through summer heat and winter cold, through rainstorms that turned paths to mud and snowstorms that made mountain passes impassable. You walked knowing you might not make it home again. Disease killed pilgrims, accidents claimed others, bandits murdered those who seemed worth robbing. The Camino was lined with graves of those who had started the journey but never finished it, their bodies buried in foreign soil far from family and home. And yet people kept walking year after year, century after century, driven by something deeper than reason, something that made the risk worthwhile. The story of how St. James supposedly came to rest in Galicia begins not with archaeology, but with legend. The kind of story medieval people told in flickering candlelight, embellishing details with each retelling until history and miracle became impossible to separate. According to the tale that took root across Christian Europe, James the Greater, brother of John the Evangelist and one of Jesus Christ's closest disciples, had travelled to Spain during his lifetime to preach the gospel in what was then the far western edge of the Roman Empire, a place Romans called Finisterre, the end of the earth, where land stopped and the unknown ocean began. The historical James, the one documented in the New Testament, was executed in Jerusalem around the year 44 by order of King Herod Agrippa, becoming the first of the apostles to be martyred. The Bible says nothing about what happened to his body after death, but legend, unconstrained by evidence, tells a different story. It claims that James's disciples, heartbroken and determined, took his corpse and placed it in a stone boat with no oars, no sails, no crew, trusting God to guide it wherever divine will intended. And somehow, miraculously, the boat drifted across the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast, and landed in Galicia, where the disciples buried James in a secret location before returning east. For 800 years, the story goes, the tomb lay forgotten, hidden beneath earth and vegetation, known only to local spirits and the wild things that roam the forests. Christianity spread across Europe during those centuries. The Roman Empire fell, Germanic tribes carved new kingdoms from the wreckage, but James slept undisturbed in his Spanish grave, waiting for the moment when he would be needed again. That moment came in the early 9th century, specifically around the year 814, though dates in this period are more suggestion than certainty. The Christian kingdoms of northern Spain were locked in constant warfare with the Muslim Moors who controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula, a struggle that would continue for centuries in what history calls the Reconquista. The Christians, outnumbered and often outmatched militarily, desperately needed morale, needed symbols, needed proof that God favoured their cause. They needed a miracle, and that's when Pelagius, the hermit, saw his lights in the sky. The account varies depending on which medieval chronicle you read, but the essential elements remain consistent. Pelagius, living in solitude in the hills above what is now Santiago de Compostela, witnessed strange celestial phenomena, stars that seemed to descend from the heavens and hover over a specific patch of forest. He watched night after night, convinced he was witnessing something supernatural, something that demanded investigation. Finally, he reported what he'd seen to Theodomir, the bishop of Iria Flavia, the nearest settlement with any ecclesiastical authority. Theodomir, rather than dismissing the hermit's vision as madness or imagination, took it seriously. He organised an expedition to the spot Pelagius indicated, bringing monks and workers to clear the overgrown vegetation and dig into the earth beneath. What they found, according to the official church account, was a small stone building, ancient and weathered, and inside it a tomb containing 3 skeletons. The bishop examined the remains, consulted whatever texts or traditions were available to him, and declared with absolute certainty that these were the bones of St. James the Greater and 2 of his disciples. No scientific analysis supported this identification. No carbon dating existed to determine the age of the remains. No inscription definitively named the occupants of the tomb. But Theodomir's declaration was enough. He reported his findings to King Alfonso II of Asturias, the most powerful Christian monarch in the region, who immediately recognized the political and spiritual value of such a discovery. If one of Christ's own apostles lay buried in Spanish soil, it meant Spain was specially blessed, chosen by God, destined for greatness. It gave the Christian kingdoms a rallying point, a sacred site to rival anything the Muslims could claim. Alfonso travelled to the site himself, verified the bishop's claims through his own examination, and ordered the construction of a small church over the tomb. He declared the location sacred, named it Santiago de Compostela after the apostle and the field of stars, and proclaimed that pilgrims who visited the shrine would receive spiritual benefits, forgiveness of sins, protection from damnation. The news spread quickly through the Christian kingdoms of Europe, carried by monks and merchants and travellers, embellished with each retelling until the discovery took on legendary proportions. But even in the 9th century, not everyone believed the story. Some scholars questioned how a body could have survived intact for 800 years. Others doubted that the disciples would have had the resources or ability to transport a corpse across such distances. There were whispers that the tomb might contain someone else entirely, perhaps a local Christian martyr from centuries past, perhaps a Roman official, perhaps no one of particular importance at all. Some suggested the whole thing was a deliberate fabrication, a political maneuver by the Christian kingdoms to boost morale and attract pilgrims whose spending would enrich the region. The Church, predictably, dismissed all skepticism as heresy or faithlessness. Miracles, by definition, defied natural explanation. Questioning how the body arrived in Spain was to question God's power to accomplish the impossible. The physical evidence, such as it was, mattered less than the spiritual truth the discovery represented. And the spiritual truth, Church authorities insisted, was clear. St. James had chosen Spain as his final resting place, and the faithful were obligated to honour him with pilgrimage and prayer. As the decades passed and the shrine's fame grew, more miracles were attributed to St. James. Pilgrims reported healings, visions, divine interventions that occurred after visiting the tomb. Stories spread of James himself appearing on a white horse during battles, fighting alongside Christian soldiers against the Moors, earning the title Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moorslayer. These battle miracles, however historically dubious, cemented James's role as not just a spiritual figure but a military patron, a warrior saint who actively aided the Reconquista. By the 11th century, when pilgrimage to Santiago reached its first peak, the question of whether the tomb genuinely contained St. James had become almost irrelevant. Millions believed it did, and their belief created its own reality. The pilgrimage existed, the roads were walked, the cathedral was being built, and the spiritual and economic benefits were undeniable. Whether the bones beneath the altar were truly those of a first-century apostle or some unknown individual from centuries later mattered less than the fact that people travelled vast distances to kneel before them, to pray, to weep, to feel closer to God in that stone church at the edge of the world. Modern archaeologists and historians examining the evidence with tools and skepticism unavailable to medieval believers remain divided. Some argue that the tomb likely does contain very old remains, possibly from the 1st or 2nd century, though proving they belong to James specifically is impossible. Others suggest the whole discovery was staged, that Theodomir and Alfonso conspired to create a pilgrimage site for political and economic reasons, burying random bones and declaring them sacred. Still others propose that there may have been a genuine local tradition about someone important being buried there, a tradition that predated the 9th century, and that Theodomir simply reinterpreted through the lens of Christian legend. The truth, assuming such a thing can still be recovered after 1200 years, probably lies somewhere in the uncertain territory between miracle and fabrication, between genuine belief and deliberate deception. What matters for our story is not whether the bones are authentic, but that medieval people believed they were, and that belief set in motion one of the greatest mass movements in European history, a pilgrimage that would shape culture, economics, politics and spirituality for centuries to come. When news of St. James's discovered tomb began spreading beyond Galicia in the early 9th century, it travelled through a Europe that was both deeply credulous and surprisingly sceptical, a world where people readily accepted miracles as fact, but also understood that claims of sanctity could serve political purposes, and that not every relic peddled by monks was genuine. The response to Bishop Theodomir's announcement, therefore, varied dramatically depending on who was hearing the news and what they stood to gain or lose from believing it. King Alfonso II of Asturias, as mentioned, embraced the discovery immediately and enthusiastically. For him, the timing couldn't have been better. His kingdom was small, relatively poor, constantly threatened by the much larger and wealthier Muslim territories to the south. Having an apostle's tomb within his borders gave Alfonso a legitimacy that gold and armies couldn't purchase. It meant his kingdom wasn't just another struggling Christian state clinging to the northern mountains, but a place blessed by God, chosen as the resting place of one of Christ's own followers. It gave him a powerful tool for diplomacy, a reason for other Christian monarchs to take him seriously, to send pilgrims who would bring wealth, to form alliances based on shared devotion to Santiago. Alfonso ordered the construction of that first church over the tomb, a modest building by later standards but symbolically crucial. He established a community of monks to maintain the shrine, granted them lands and privileges, ensured they had resources to accommodate the pilgrims he hoped would come. He wrote letters to other Christian rulers, announcing the discovery, describing the miracles already being attributed to the site, inviting them to visit or send representatives. He commissioned monks to write accounts of the discovery, texts that carefully detailed Pelagius's vision, Theodomir's excavation, and the overwhelming evidence, as he saw it, that the bones were genuinely those of St. James. Other Christian monarchs in Spain and France responded with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some saw the political value immediately and promoted pilgrimage to Santiago as a way to strengthen Christian unity against Muslim expansion. Charlemagne, though the stories connecting him directly to the Camino are likely later inventions, represents the kind of powerful royal endorsement the shrine needed to gain international recognition. French monasteries, particularly those aligned with the Cluniac reform movement, that would become so influential in the following centuries, began promoting Santiago pilgrimage as spiritually meritorious, writing guidebooks, establishing hospices along the routes through France and northern Spain. But there was skepticism too, quieter but persistent, especially among scholars and church officials who valued historical accuracy and doctrinal precision over popular enthusiasm. Some pointed out that no early Christian texts mentioned James travelling to Spain during his lifetime, that the entire foundation of the legend contradicted what little historical record existed about the apostle's life and death. Others questioned the convenient timing of the discovery, how it emerged exactly when Christian Spain needed a morale boost most desperately. how the tomb's location happened to fall within King Alfonso's territory, rather than in the more established Christian centres of northern Europe. There were practical concerns as well. Rome, understandably, viewed the rise of Santiago with some wariness. The Pope held authority over all of Christendom, and Rome itself was Christianity's primary pilgrimage destination, home to St. Peter's tomb and countless other relics. Having another major pilgrimage site emerge, one that might eventually rival Rome in importance and popularity, presented both theological and economic challenges. The Vatican couldn't outright deny Santiago's authenticity without evidence, but it also couldn't fully embrace a shrine that might diminish Rome's centrality. The solution was cautious acknowledgement, official recognition that never quite rose to the enthusiastic promotion that Spanish bishops hoped for. Among common people, those who would actually make up the majority of pilgrims in coming centuries, the response was simpler and more immediate. They heard stories of miracles, of sick pilgrims healed, of sinners forgiven, of the dead apostle appearing in dreams to offer guidance and comfort. They heard that walking to Santiago could erase years of penance, could guarantee a place in heaven, could solve problems that prayer alone hadn't touched. For peasants living in poverty, for people suffering from illness or grief or guilt, for those desperate enough to try anything that might improve their circumstances, the promise of Santiago was irresistible. The first pilgrims to make the journey, those who walked the rough paths in the decades immediately following the discovery, found conditions primitive. There were no established routes yet, no hospices, no guidebooks. They relied on local knowledge, asked directions from village to village, took wrong turns, got lost in mountains or forests, sometimes never reached their destination at all. But those who did make it to Santiago returned home with stories that attracted others. They described the small church built over the tomb, the monks who chanted prayers day and night, the feeling of standing in the presence of an apostle's remains. They brought back scallop shells from the Galician coast as proof of their journey, shells that became the universal symbol of Santiago pilgrimage, worn pinned to cloaks and hats by anyone who had walked the Camino. As more pilgrims made the journey and returned alive to tell about it, skepticism gradually gave way to acceptance, at least among the general population. The scholarly doubts persisted. The questions about historical accuracy remained unanswered, but popular belief operated on different principles. If thousands of people were willing to walk hundreds of miles to visit the tomb, if miracles were being reported, if the church officially recognized the shrine, then surely the bones must be authentic. Surely God wouldn't allow such a massive deception to flourish if the whole thing was fraudulent. The Muslim authorities who controlled most of Spain responded to Santiago's rise with a mixture of disdain and concern. They saw the Christian shrine as a symbol of the enemy's resilience, evidence that the northern Christian kingdoms weren't going to simply fade away or accept Muslim dominance peacefully. Some Muslim chroniclers mocked the Christian claims, pointing out the absurdity of a corpse travelling by boat from Jerusalem to Galicia without any crew. Others recognized that Santiago was becoming a rallying point for Christian resistance, that pilgrims walking to the shrine were also walking through territory that might need to be defended or reconquered. The pilgrimage routes, in a sense, were marking out the future battle lines of the Reconquista. There were attempts to suppress the shrine militarily. In the late 10th century, the powerful Muslim general al-Mansur led raids deep into Christian territory, attacking monasteries and churches, and in 997 he reached Santiago de Compostela itself. His forces destroyed much of the town and the church, though according to legend they spared the tomb itself out of respect or perhaps superstitious fear. The raid was devastating, but it didn't end the pilgrimage. Christians rebuilt stronger than before, and the destruction became part of Santiago's story, proof of the shrine's importance, evidence that even Muslim armies recognized the threat it represented. By the 11th century, roughly 200 years after that initial discovery, Santiago de Compostela had become firmly established as one of Christianity's three great pilgrimage destinations alongside Jerusalem and Rome. The skepticism hadn't disappeared entirely. Scholars still quietly questioned the evidence, but it had been overwhelmed by popular devotion and institutional support. The pilgrimage had taken on a life of its own, existing independent of whether the bones in the tomb were genuinely those of St. James or not. Millions believed, and their belief made Santiago real in ways that transcended archaeology or historical documentation. The problem with St. James's presence in Spain, the fundamental contradiction that scholars wrestled with even as millions of pilgrims accepted the legend without question, was that almost nothing about the official story made historical sense when examined with even minimal scrutiny. The New Testament, the earliest and most reliable source for information about the apostles, mentions James the Greater only briefly and says nothing whatsoever about him travelling to Spain during his lifetime, or his body being transported there after death. What the Bible does tell us about James is sparse but definitive. He was the son of Zebedee, a fisherman from Galilee, brother to John the Evangelist, one of the inner circle of disciples who witnessed Christ's transfiguration and agony in Gethsemane. He was among the first called to follow Jesus, abandoning his nets and his father to become a fisher of men instead. And he was, according to the Acts of the Apostles, executed by King Herod Agrippa in Jerusalem around the year 44, making him the first of the 12 apostles to be martyred. After that single sentence recording his death, James disappears from the biblical narrative entirely. No mention of burial location, no description of what happened to his remains, nothing to suggest Spain had anything to do with his story. Early Christian historians and church fathers, writing in the centuries immediately following the Apostolic Age, also make no mention of James in Spain. Eusebius, whose ecclesiastical history written in the early 4th century attempted to document the spread of Christianity and the fates of the apostles, says only that James was killed in Jerusalem. St. Jerome, compiling his catalogue of early Christian writers around the same time, doesn't connect James to the Iberian Peninsula. The Martyrologium Hieronymianum, a 6th century list of martyrs and their burial locations, places James's tomb in Jerusalem, not Galicia. So where did the Spanish legend come from? How did an apostle who died in Jerusalem in the 1st century somehow end up buried at the far western edge of Europe? And why did this claim not emerge until the 9th century, 800 years after the supposed events? The earliest written source connecting James to Spain appears to be a 7th century text attributed to Saint Isidore of Seville, which briefly mentions that James preached in Spain and the western regions before returning to Judea where he was martyred. But even this reference is vague, possibly added by later copyists, and says nothing about his body being brought back to Spain after death. The legend as it was told in the 9th century and after included far more elaborate details, miraculous elements that had no basis in historical record. According to the fully developed medieval version of the story, James had indeed travelled to Spain during his lifetime, spending several years preaching the gospel in Galicia and converting the pagan inhabitants to Christianity. After his execution in Jerusalem, his disciples, heartbroken but determined to honour their master, placed his body in a stone boat and set it adrift on the Mediterranean with no human guidance, trusting God to direct it to its proper resting place. The boat, carried by divine wind or angelic hands depending on which version you heard, sailed west through the Straits of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast and landed at the mouth of the Ulla River in Galicia. The disciples supposedly brought the body ashore, placed it on a large stone which miraculously softened like wax to receive the corpse, and buried James in a secret location to protect the tomb from Roman persecution. They then disappeared from the story, presumably returning east or dying in Spain, and the exact location of the burial was forgotten over the following centuries as Christianity retreated under Muslim invasion, and the old Roman infrastructure crumbled into ruin. Every element of this narrative raises questions. Why would disciples risk the long and dangerous journey to Spain rather than burying James in Jerusalem where he died, where he was known, where early Christian communities were already established? How would a stone boat navigate thousands of miles of ocean without sails or oars? Why would God choose Galicia, at the time a remote and sparsely populated region, at the very edge of the known world, as the final resting place for one of Christ's closest followers? And most importantly, if the tomb was so significant, why did no one know about it, write about it, or visit it for 800 years? The skeptics, both medieval and modern, have proposed various explanations. Some suggest the whole thing was a pious fraud, that Bishop Theodomir and King Alfonso deliberately fabricated the discovery to create a pilgrimage site that would bring prestige and wealth to their struggling kingdom. In this interpretation, the bones in the tomb were either random remains or perhaps those of a local Christian martyr from centuries earlier, redentified as James for political purposes. The miracle stories, the celestial lights, the convenient visions, all serve to provide divine validation for what was essentially a forgery. Others propose a more nuanced possibility, that there may have been a genuine local tradition in Galicia about an important Christian figure being buried there, a tradition that predated the 9th century but had lost its specific details over time. When Theodomir discovered the tomb, he interpreted this vague tradition through the lens of what would be most valuable and impressive, connecting the unknown remains to the famous Apostle James rather than to whoever was actually buried there. In this version, Theodomir may have genuinely believed he had found James, not because of evidence, but because faith and wishful thinking convinced him it must be true. A third explanation focuses on the political and military context of 9th century Spain. The Christian kingdoms were locked in desperate struggle with Muslim forces, outnumbered and often outmatched, in need of any advantage they could find. Having an apostle's tomb within Christian territory provided not just spiritual encouragement, but a powerful propaganda tool. It suggested divine favour, that God had chosen Christian Spain for special blessing, that the Reconquista was not just a political or military campaign, but a holy war sanctioned by heaven itself. In this light, whether the bones were genuinely James's mattered less than the morale boost and international attention the claim generated. Modern archaeology has tried to shed light on the question, though with limited success. Excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries beneath the cathedral at Santiago de Compostela did find ancient remains, including bones that carbon dating suggested were very old, possibly 1st or 2nd century. But determining whether these specific bones belonged to a 1st century Jewish man from Galilee, let alone proving that man was James the Apostle, is impossible with current technology. DNA analysis would require comparison samples from known relatives, which obviously don't exist. The bones prove only that someone was buried there long ago, not who that someone was. What makes the contradiction particularly fascinating is that it didn't seem to bother most medieval pilgrims. They weren't walking to Santiago to verify archaeological evidence or reconcile historical inconsistencies. They were seeking forgiveness, healing, transformation, connection to the divine. Whether the bones beneath the cathedral altar were genuinely those of St. James or not was for them almost beside the point. The pilgrimage worked, it changed lives, it offered hope and meaning and community. The spiritual reality of Santiago existed independent of the historical accuracy of the legend, and perhaps that's the deepest contradiction of all, that something built on a foundation that may be entirely fictional could nonetheless produce genuine spiritual and cultural results, that a lie, if it even was a lie, could contain profound truth. The medieval world understood this in ways modern rationalism sometimes struggles with. They knew that legends served purposes beyond factual accuracy, that stories could be true in deeper senses even if the specific details were invented or embellished. Santiago de Compostela became real through the faith of millions, and that faith created something that transcended the question of whether a 1st century apostle actually rested in Spanish soil. For nearly 1200 years, historians, archaeologists, theologians, and skeptics have debated the Santiago question, proposing theories that range from complete acceptance of the medieval legend to total dismissal of it as fabrication. The debate continues today, though with more sophisticated tools and less at stake politically than in centuries past when questioning the authenticity of a major pilgrimage site could bring accusations of heresy. What emerges from examining these competing theories is not a clear answer, but a complex picture of how faith, politics, economics, and culture intertwine to create historical narratives that may or may not reflect what actually happened. The traditionalist position, held primarily by devout Catholics and the church officials who maintain the Santiago shrine, accepts the essential truth of the legend, while acknowledging that some details may have been embellished over centuries of retelling. In this view, James did travel to Spain during his lifetime to evangelize the region. He was martyred in Jerusalem as the Bible states, and his disciples did manage to transport his body back to Galicia for burial. The miraculous elements, the stone boats sailing without crew, the celestial lights guiding Pelagius to the tomb, are understood as literal divine interventions or as symbolic representations of real events that seemed miraculous to those who witnessed them. Traditionalists point to the early Christian tradition of preserving apostolic relics and establishing shrines at burial sites as evidence that James's disciples would have made extraordinary efforts to honour their teacher's remains. They note that Galicia, while remote, was part of the Roman Empire during the 1st century and therefore not completely inaccessible to determined travellers. They argue that the absence of written records mentioning James in Spain before the 7th century doesn't prove the tradition didn't exist earlier, only that it wasn't written down, which was common for oral traditions in a period when literacy was rare and writing materials expensive. The political fabrication theory, popular among rationalist historians of the 19th and 20th centuries, takes the opposite extreme. It argues that Bishop Theodomir and King Alfonso deliberately conspired to create a pilgrimage site by falsely identifying random remains as those of St. James. In this interpretation, the 9th century discovery was entirely staged. The bones were either found by accident and opportunistically relabeled, or were planted specifically to be discovered. The motivation was clear: to strengthen Christian morale during the Reconquista, to attract pilgrims whose spending would enrich the region, and to give the Kingdom of Asturias international prestige it otherwise lacked. This theory points to the suspiciously convenient timing of the discovery, how it emerged exactly when Christian Spain needed it most. It notes that the story contains elements common to medieval forgeries, the visions and miracles that conveniently validate the claim, the lack of documentary evidence, the gaps in the chain of custody spanning 8 centuries. It observes that creating false relics and shrines was not uncommon in medieval Europe, that churches and monasteries competed for pilgrims and their donations, and that many supposedly authentic relics were later proven to be fraudulent. A more moderate position, which has gained support among modern historians, suggests that the Santiago legend may have roots in a genuine local tradition that was reinterpreted and elaborated over time. Perhaps there was an early Christian community in Galicia. Perhaps someone of importance was buried there in the 1st or 2nd century. Perhaps stories about this person were passed down through generations but lost their specific details. When Theodomir found ancient remains in the 9th century, he may have genuinely believed, based on fragmentary local traditions and his own religious convictions, that he had discovered St. James's tomb. In this view, it wasn't deliberate fraud, but rather sincere misidentification, combining vague historical memory with wishful thinking and political motivation. Some scholars have explored the possibility that the Santiago legend borrowed elements from pre-Christian Celtic or Roman traditions. Galicia was known in ancient times for its connection to the Western Ocean, to the setting sun, to the edge of the world where the living met the dead. Celtic peoples in the region had sacred sites associated with death and the afterlife. Roman writers mention mysterious western islands where heroes were believed to rest. It's possible that when Christianity arrived in Galicia, it absorbed these older traditions, reinterpreting pagan sacred sites as Christian ones, associating James with locations that had always been considered spiritually significant for other reasons. Another theory focuses on the scallop shell, the symbol so intimately connected to Santiago pilgrimage. These shells are abundant on the Galician coast, and evidence suggests they held symbolic importance in the region long before Christianity arrived. Some historians propose that pilgrimage to Galicia's western shore, to witness the sunset over the Atlantic and collect scallop shells, predated the Santiago legend and was later Christianized by associating the destination with an apostle's tomb. In this interpretation, the pilgrimage created the saint rather than the saint creating the pilgrimage. There are also theories about James's role as Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Slayer, the warrior saint who appeared on a white horse during battles against Muslim forces. Skeptics note that this military aspect of James's cult emerged centuries after the tomb's discovery and served obvious propaganda purposes during the Reconquista. They argue that James was essentially turned into a Christian equivalent of a war god, that his peaceful apostolic identity was subsumed by the military needs of medieval Spanish kingdoms. Traditionalists counter that the military miracles were genuine divine interventions, and that James's role as protector of Christian Spain was consistent with his identity as a zealous defender of the faith during his lifetime. Modern archaeological and scientific approaches have tried to resolve the debate through physical evidence. Excavations beneath Santiago's cathedral in the 19th century, led by Cardinal Miguel Payá y Rico, claim to have found remains that matched the traditional descriptions of James's burial. The bones were examined, declared authentic by church authorities, and placed in a silver reliquary where they remain today. However, the excavation methods were not rigorous by modern standards. The analysis was conducted by people with vested interest in confirming the traditional story, and no independent verification was allowed. More recent scientific studies have been limited by the Church's reluctance to permit invasive testing of the relics. Carbon dating could potentially determine the age of the bones, whether they date to the 1st century as the legend claims or to some later period. DNA analysis, while unable to prove the bones belong to James specifically, could at least determine their geographic origin, whether they came from the Eastern Mediterranean or were local to Spain. But such tests would require removing samples from the relics, a process the Church has consistently refused to authorize, arguing that faith matters more than scientific verification and that the bones' authenticity has already been proven through centuries of miracles and devotion. The debate, ultimately, may be unresolvable with current evidence. Each theory has strengths and weaknesses, supporting evidence and contradictory facts. What seems clear is that the truth, whatever it might be, is almost certainly more complex than either complete acceptance or total dismissal of the legend. Medieval history rarely offers the kind of clear, documented certainty that modern minds crave. Instead, it gives us fragments, contradictions, stories that may be true or false or some mixture of both, and the challenge of interpreting them honestly while acknowledging the limits of what we can know. What none of the theories dispute is that the Santiago pilgrimage became immensely important regardless of whether the bones were authentic, that it shaped European culture and history in profound ways, and that millions of people found genuine meaning and transformation through walking the Camino, whether St. James was actually buried at the end of it or not. The effort to understand the historical reality behind the Santiago legend has occupied scholars for centuries, each generation bringing new tools and perspectives to the investigation, while grappling with the fundamental problem that most of the evidence has been lost to time, destroyed by war, rotted away, or never existed in the first place. What remains is fragmentary, a puzzle with most of its pieces missing, and no guarantee that the pieces we have even belong to the same picture. The earliest serious historical investigation into Santiago's authenticity came not from skeptics, but from within the Church itself, from scholars who believed in the sanctity of relics but also valued historical accuracy. In the 16th century, during the Counter-Reformation, when Protestant critics were challenging Catholic veneration of saints and relics, Church historians began systematically examining the documentary evidence for major pilgrimage sites. They reviewed martyrologies, early church writings, anything that might substantiate or contradict the legends that had grown up around various shrines. What they found regarding Santiago was troubling. No mention of James in Spain in any text before the 7th century. No early martyrology placing his tomb in Galicia. Even the 7th century reference attributed to Isidore of Seville was ambiguous, and possibly a later addition. The historian Cardinal Cesare Baronius, compiling his Annales Ecclesiastici in the late 1500s, expressed doubt about the Spanish tradition, noting the absence of early evidence. Other church scholars defended Santiago, arguing that absence of written evidence didn't constitute proof of falsehood, that oral traditions could preserve truth even when documentation failed. The investigation took on new urgency in the 19th century, when archaeological methods became more sophisticated and historical criticism more rigorous. Spanish scholars, patriotic and religious, but also committed to scientific inquiry, began systematically examining the physical evidence at Santiago de Compostela. They studied the architecture of the cathedral, trying to determine which parts dated to which periods, looking for evidence of that original 9th century church that supposedly was built over James's tomb. They found that the current cathedral, begun in the 11th century, was built on the foundations of earlier structures. Excavations revealed remains of that first small church from Alfonso's time, and beneath that Roman-era construction, possibly a cemetery or mausoleum. The presence of very old structures proved that the site had been significant for a long time, but it didn't prove why it had been significant or who was buried there. Ancient tombs could belong to anyone, a Roman official, a wealthy merchant, a local Christian martyr, not necessarily an apostle from Jerusalem. The most dramatic archaeological moment came in 1889 when workers renovating the cathedral discovered a hidden crypt behind the main altar. Inside were bones that had apparently been hidden there centuries earlier, possibly during the 16th century when church authorities feared English pirate Francis Drake might raid Santiago and desecrate the relics. Cardinal Paiai Rico, who oversaw the excavation, declared these to be the authentic remains of St. James and his two disciples, matching the traditional accounts of 3 bodies in the original tomb. The announcement was met with celebration in Spain and among Catholics worldwide, but also with skepticism from historians and scientists who noted that the excavation had been conducted hastily, without proper documentation, and that the conclusions seemed predetermined by religious conviction rather than derived from evidence. The bones were old, certainly, but precisely how old couldn't be determined with 19th century methods. They could be 1st century, or 3rd century, or 5th century. They could have come from the eastern Mediterranean, or from local populations. Nothing about them definitively proved or disproved the Santiago legend. Modern investigators have pursued different lines of inquiry, recognizing that proving or disproving the presence of James's physical remains may be impossible, but that other aspects of the story can be examined. They've studied the development of the pilgrimage itself, tracing how the routes evolved, how the infrastructure grew, how the legend spread through medieval Europe. They've analysed pilgrim accounts, those precious few that were written down, trying to understand what motivated people to make the journey and what they experienced along the way. One crucial source is the Codex Calixtinus, a 12th century manuscript that served as both spiritual guide and practical handbook for Santiago pilgrims. Attributed to Pope Calixtus II, but almost certainly compiled by French monks, particularly one Emeric Picaud, the Codex contains sermons about St. James, accounts of miracles attributed to the saint, descriptions of the pilgrimage routes through France and Spain, and practical advice about where to find safe lodging and clean water. Scholars have mined this text for insights into how 12th century Christians understood the pilgrimage, what they believed about James, and how the legend had developed by that point. The Codex reveals that by the 1200s, only 3 centuries after the tomb's discovery, the Santiago legend had become enormously elaborate. The basic story of James preaching in Spain and his body being brought there after martyrdom had acquired layers of additional miracles and details. There were accounts of James appearing to Charlemagne in dreams, commanding him to liberate the pilgrimage route from Muslim control, a story almost certainly fictional since Charlemagne died before the Santiago pilgrimage became prominent. There were descriptions of James's military appearances during battles, riding a white horse and slaughtering Muslims by the hundreds. There were miracle stories of pilgrims healed, sinners forgiven, the dead raised, all through James's intercession. Historians studying the Codex and other medieval sources have traced how the legend evolved, how each generation added new elements that served contemporary needs. The warrior St. James emerged during the height of the Reconquista, when Christian kingdoms needed military inspiration. The elaborate miracle stories multiplied as competition increased between different pilgrimage sites, each trying to attract more pilgrims. The practical guidebook elements developed as the pilgrimage became big business, with monasteries and towns along the route competing for pilgrim spending. Another investigative approach has focused on the scallop shell symbolism, trying to understand its origins and what it might reveal about pre-Christian traditions in Galicia. Marine archaeologists and anthropologists have studied ancient shell middens along the Galician coast, evidence of human habitation going back thousands of years. They found that scallop shells appear in prehistoric burials, suggesting symbolic importance long before Christianity arrived. Some researchers propose that Galicia's western coast was a sacred landscape in Celtic religion, associated with the setting sun and the journey of souls to the afterlife, and that the scallop shell was a symbol of that spiritual geography. If this theory is correct, it would mean that pilgrimage to western Galicia predated Christianity, that people were travelling to the coast for religious reasons before anyone heard of St. James. Christianity would have absorbed this existing sacred tradition, reinterpreted the destination through a Christian lens, and the scallop shell symbol would have transitioned from pagan to Christian use. The Santiago legend, in this view, didn't create the pilgrimage but rather provided a new explanation for a practice that was already ancient. Linguistic investigators have examined place names along the Camino, looking for clues about when the routes became established and what they were called before they were associated with Santiago. They've found evidence that some sections of the pilgrimage path follow even older routes, Roman roads that connected cities in northern Spain, trade paths that predated Roman conquest, migration routes that humans had used for millennia. The Camino, it appears, didn't create new paths, but rather sacralized existing ones, giving religious meaning to roads that people had always travelled for commercial or strategic reasons. Despite centuries of investigation using increasingly sophisticated methods, the fundamental question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Are those bones in the cathedral at Santiago de Compostela the remains of James the Apostle? The evidence suggests we'll never know with certainty. What we do know is that medieval people believed they were, and that belief transformed European culture in ways that had nothing to do with whether the belief was factually accurate. What survives from the medieval pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela is fragmentary but evocative, physical remnants of a world where millions walked ancient paths carrying hopes and fears and faith across hostile landscapes. These artifacts, scattered through museums and monasteries and private collections across Europe, speak to the reality of the pilgrimage in ways that legends and debates cannot. They are the material proof that something profound happened along those roads, that people invested enormous time and resources, and sometimes their lives, in reaching Santiago, regardless of whether St. James actually rested there. The most ubiquitous artifact is the scallop shell, the vieira that became the universal symbol of Santiago pilgrimage. Medieval pilgrims collected these shells from beaches near Santiago and wore them pinned to their cloaks or hats as proof they had completed the journey. Museums across Europe hold thousands of medieval scallop shells, some plain, others decorated with incised crosses or images of St. James, many with holes drilled for attaching to clothing. They turn up in archaeological excavations from England to Poland, carried home by pilgrims and buried with them when they died, a final testament to the most important journey of their lives. But the shells served more than symbolic purposes. Pilgrims used them as drinking vessels, scooping water from streams during long days of walking. They used them to eat from when stopping at monasteries or hospices that provided meals. The shell's distinctive ridged pattern, radiating out from a single point, was interpreted as representing the various pilgrimage routes across Europe that converged at Santiago, all roads leading to one destination just as all the shell's ridges met at its base. Alongside shells, museums preserve pilgrim badges, small metal tokens that pilgrims purchased at Santiago or at stops along the way. These badges, made of lead or pewter, depicted St. James in various poses, often shown as a pilgrim himself with staff and shell, sometimes on horseback as the warrior saint. Pilgrims sewed these badges onto their cloaks, creating a kind of visual resume of their travels. A cloak covered with badges from different shrines announced that its wearer was an experienced pilgrim, someone who had walked not just to Santiago but perhaps to Rome, to Canterbury, to various regional saints' tombs. These badges were valuable, both spiritually and socially, markers of status and devotion that commanded respect. The pilgrim's staff, made of wood and typically taller than the person carrying it, rarely survives because wood decays. But enough examples have been preserved in monastery collections or found in bogs and other anaerobic environments to give us a sense of what these essential tools looked like. They were sturdy but lightweight, often with an iron point on the bottom for traction on muddy or rocky paths, sometimes with decorative carvings at the top. The staff served multiple purposes, as walking aid on difficult terrain, as weapon against bandits or wild animals, as tent pole when sleeping outdoors, as a way to test water depth when crossing streams. It was both practical tool and spiritual symbol, representing the pilgrim's journey through life toward heaven. We have surviving examples of pilgrim clothing too, though these are rarer since fabric deteriorates quickly. The typical pilgrim wore a long cloak made of rough wool, sturdy enough to provide warmth and weather protection, but simple enough to signal humility. Underneath was a tunic, often made of undyed linen or wool. On the head, a broad-brimmed hat that shielded against sun and rain. On the feet, leather shoes or boots, though many pilgrims walked barefoot as an additional penance. Around the waist, a leather pouch or bag for carrying bread, money, and small personal items. The entire outfit was designed for durability and functionality, nothing decorative or fashionable, everything practical for months of hard walking. Some of the most poignant artifacts are the personal items pilgrims lost or discarded along the way. Archaeological excavations at medieval hospices and along known pilgrimage routes have uncovered coins from across Europe, proof of how far pilgrims travelled. They found rosaries and prayer books, crutches left behind by pilgrims who believed they'd been healed, toys that suggest families sometimes made the journey together. They found letters, though these are extremely rare since most pilgrims were illiterate. Messages written by scribes for pilgrims who wanted to send word home about their progress, or to request prayers or money. The hospices themselves provide evidence. those way stations established along the Camino where pilgrims could find shelter and food. Many of these buildings still stand, converted to other uses or maintained as historical sites. They were simple structures, usually single-story stone buildings with large communal sleeping rooms, where dozens of pilgrims crowded together on straw mattresses or the floor itself. There were kitchens where monks or lay servants prepared simple meals, usually bread and soup, occasionally meat. There were chapels for prayers. The largest hospices in major towns along the route could accommodate hundreds of pilgrims per night during peak season. Church records from these hospices sometimes survive, ledgers recording how many pilgrims were sheltered, what nationalities they represented, occasionally what illnesses they suffered or how they died if they didn't survive the journey. These records reveal the staggering scale of the pilgrimage at its medieval peak. The hospice at Roncesvalles, at the pass through the Pyrenees between France and Spain, recorded sheltering over 25,000 pilgrims in a single year during the 1200s. The Hospital of San Marcos in Leon, one of the most famous hospices, could feed and house more than 300 pilgrims simultaneously. We have architectural evidence in the churches and cathedrals built along the Camino, distinctive buildings designed specifically to accommodate large numbers of pilgrims. These so-called pilgrimage churches followed a common plan: large naves that could hold crowds, ambulatories that allowed pilgrims to circulate around the building, to view relics without disrupting services, radiating chapels where small groups could pray. The Cathedral of Santiago itself, begun in the late 1100s and built over centuries, represents the apex of this architectural style, a massive stone statement of faith and power designed to awe pilgrims who had walked months to reach it. The cathedral's Portico de la Gloria, completed in the 1188 by Master Matteo, remains one of medieval Europe's greatest sculptural achievements. Pilgrims entering the cathedral passed beneath this intricate stone facade depicting Christ in glory. Apostles, prophets, angels, and the saved and damned on Judgment Day. The central column features a carved tree of Jesse, the genealogy of Christ, and tradition held that pilgrims should place their hand on the column and pray, a practice that over centuries wore a visible handprint into the stone. That worn spot still exists, testament to millions of hands reaching out in hope and desperation and gratitude. We have documentary evidence beyond church records. Wills sometimes mention plans to make Santiago pilgrimage, or bequests to pay for someone else to make the journey on the deceased's behalf. Court records note criminals sentenced to pilgrimage as punishment. Royal chronicles describe kings and nobles who made the journey, the few surviving personal accounts by pilgrims themselves, like that of German monk Hermann König or the Icelander Nicholas of Munkathvera, provide invaluable glimpses into what the experience actually felt like, the exhaustion and wonder, the dangers encountered, the prayers offered at each stage of the route. Physical evidence exists in the landscape itself, the paths worn into stone by centuries of pilgrim feet, the crosses erected at difficult mountain passes, the bridges built to help pilgrims cross rivers, the boundary markers indicating the approach to Santiago. In some places, if you know where to look, you can still see the medieval path, distinguished from later roads by its narrowness and the way it takes a more directive, steeper route, rather than the gradual switchbacks modern engineering prefers. All these fragments together paint a picture of a living, breathing phenomenon that touched every level of medieval society. The evidence shows that Santiago pilgrimage was not just an elite practice, but a genuinely popular movement that attracted people from all classes and all corners of Europe, united by shared faith in a destination they believed held the power to transform their lives. Beneath the official narrative of Santiago pilgrimage, the story of pious Christians walking to an apostle's tomb to earn forgiveness and demonstrate devotion, lay motivations and realities that medieval church authorities preferred not to emphasize. The pilgrimage, when examined closely, reveals itself as something far more complex and human than the spiritual journey portrayed in sermons and hagiographies. It was about faith, certainly, but also about escape, adventure, commerce, crime, sex, and the simple human need to break free from the constraints of ordinary life. The criminal element was significant and rarely acknowledged in religious accounts. Medieval courts frequently sentenced offenders to make Santiago pilgrimage as punishment, an alternative to execution or imprisonment that served multiple purposes. It removed criminals from their communities for months or years. It forced them to undergo genuine hardship as penance. and it gave them opportunity for spiritual transformation while also giving their victims time to heal or move on. The types of crimes punished this way range from theft and assault to heresy and murder. These sentenced pilgrims walked the Camino in chains, literal iron shackles around their ankles, sometimes around their wrists as well, marking them clearly as criminals so that hospices and other pilgrims would know to be cautious. Church records from Santiago note the regular arrival of chained pilgrims who, upon reaching the cathedral, would have their shackles removed by priests in a ceremony that symbolized their release from sin. The chains would be left at the cathedral as offerings, and for centuries the building accumulated so much iron from discarded shackles that it was periodically melted down and sold to fund cathedral maintenance. But not all criminal pilgrims were sentenced by courts. Some were fugitives, people who had committed crimes and fled their home regions, using pilgrimage as convenient cover for travel. A person on pilgrimage enjoyed certain legal protections, theoretically couldn't be arrested or detained without serious cause, and could move across borders more easily than ordinary travellers. Murderers, thieves, even heretics sometimes took up pilgrim staff and shell to escape justice, blending into the crowds of legitimate pilgrims while putting hundreds of miles between themselves and those who sought them. The economic motivations were equally unspoken but widely understood. Merchants used pilgrimage as excuse for commercial travel, their packs filled with trade goods rather than religious items. They would buy low in one region, sell high in another, all while enjoying the legal protections and reduced tolls that pilgrims received. Some made fortunes this way, walking the Camino multiple times not for spiritual benefit but for profit. The church tacitly accepted this as long as the merchants maintained appearances and made appropriate donations at shrines along the way. Then there were those fleeing bad marriages, impossible debts, family obligations they couldn't bear. Pilgrimage offered a socially acceptable form of escape. A person could announce their intention to walk to Santiago, and no one could reasonably object. It was a holy endeavour, and suddenly they were free from spouse, children, creditors, all the entanglements that made life suffocating. Some pilgrims intended to return home eventually, others had no such plans. They would reach Santiago, stay a while working odd jobs in the city, then perhaps walk on to another shrine, or settle in a new town under a new name, leaving their old life permanently behind. The sexual dimension of pilgrimage was rarely discussed in polite company, but was widely acknowledged in practice. Thousands of people, mostly young and healthy enough to survive the journey, thrown together on the road for months, sleeping in crowded hospice dormitories, sharing the intimacy of hardship and danger, inevitably formed romantic and sexual attachments. Some of these were genuine love connections that led to marriage after the pilgrimage ended. Others were brief encounters, passion born of exhaustion and loneliness, and the strange freedom that came from being far from home, where normal social rules didn't quite apply. Women pilgrims faced particular dangers and opportunities. They were vulnerable to assault from bandits and even from male pilgrims, but they also found a kind of freedom impossible in their home communities. A woman on pilgrimage could travel without male family members, could make decisions independently, could meet people and see places that would never be available to her otherwise. Some women used pilgrimage as escape from forced marriages or abusive situations. Others found that the skills they developed on the road, navigation, negotiation, physical endurance, gave them confidence and competence they brought home with them. There was a whole economy built around serving pilgrims, and not all of it was savoury. Legitimate hospices run by monks offered shelter and food, for free or for small donations. But there were also commercial inns and taverns along the Camino where unscrupulous innkeepers overcharged pilgrims, watered their wine, served spoiled food, and sometimes robbed them while they slept. The Codex Calixtinus, that 12th century pilgrim guide, includes bitter warnings about specific towns and innkeepers known for cheating pilgrims, describing them in terms that make clear this was a widespread problem. Prostitution thrived along popular pilgrimage routes. Women working in brothels near major pilgrim stops found steady customers among men who had been walking for weeks or months with little female company. Church authorities condemned this commerce, of course, but they also tacitly accepted it as an inevitable consequence of bringing thousands of men through an area. Some brothels were even located in buildings owned by monasteries, the church profiting indirectly from vice it officially opposed. There were false relics sold to credulous pilgrims, Splinters of wood claimed to be from Christ's cross, vials of milk supposedly from the Virgin Mary, bones of saints that were actually animal bones or worse. There were fake miracle workers who staged healings to attract donations. There were con artists who posed as injured pilgrims needing assistance, then robbed those who helped them. The pilgrimage route, because it concentrated large numbers of people with money far from home, attracted every variety of scammer and thief. Some pilgrims had motives that were more adventure than devotion. Young men especially saw the Camino as a chance to prove themselves, to test their endurance, to see distant lands and have stories to tell. The spiritual element might be genuine but secondary to the appeal of adventure, of escaping the monotony of peasant life or the restrictions of urban apprenticeship. Walking to Santiago became a rite of passage, something young men did to transition from youth to adulthood, and the religious framework provided acceptable justification for what was really just wanderlust. Political pilgrims existed too, nobles and officials who used religious journeys as diplomatic cover, meeting with counterparts from other kingdoms along the way, negotiating alliances or trade agreements in monastery cloisters while ostensibly praying. Kings sometimes sent representatives on pilgrimage to Santiago as a way of projecting power, demonstrating that their influence extended across Christian Europe, and the pilgrimage infrastructure provided a ready-made diplomatic network. What emerges from looking at these hidden dimensions is a picture of pilgrimage as profoundly human, messy and complex and rarely fitting the neat categories of purely spiritual or purely mercenary. Most pilgrims probably had mixed motivations, some combination of genuine faith, practical need, personal crisis, curiosity, and simple human restlessness. The journey changed them not because they reached a sacred destination, but because travelling hundreds of miles on foot, suffering privation and danger, meeting strangers who became companions, pushes anyone out of their comfort zone and forces growth whether they intended it or not. The 12th century marked the transformation of Santiago pilgrimage from regional devotional practice into one of medieval Europe's defining cultural phenomena, a shift so profound that it reshaped not just the Camino itself, but the entire landscape through which it passed. What had been rough paths walked by hundreds became established routes travelled by thousands, then tens of thousands, the infrastructure growing to match the demand until the pilgrimage became a highway of faith and commerce and cultural exchange that rivaled the great trade routes of the ancient world. The change didn't happen overnight, but accelerated dramatically around the year 1100, driven by converging forces that transformed both the pilgrimage and the Europe through which it moved. The first catalyst was political, the gradual success of the Reconquista, creating more stable Christian territories in northern Spain, making the journey safer and more practical. By the late 1100s, the route from the Pyrenees to Santiago passed almost entirely through Christian kingdoms, eliminating the danger of having to cross hostile Muslim territory that had made the pilgrimage nearly suicidal in earlier centuries. The second catalyst was ecclesiastical reform, particularly the influence of the Cluniac monastic order. The Cluniacs, based at their great abbey in Burgundy, promoted pilgrimage as essential spiritual practice and established a network of monasteries along the French routes to Santiago, specifically to serve pilgrims. These weren't just hospices, but sophisticated institutions that offered medical care, supplied provisions, provided guides, and maintained the roads themselves. The Cluniac network turned what had been a dangerous venture into a manageable journey, knowing that every 30 or 40 miles you would find shelter and assistance. The third catalyst was demographic and economic. Europe's population was growing, agricultural productivity was improving, trade was expanding, and more people had the resources and time to undertake long pilgrimages. The 11th and 12th centuries saw the rise of a merchant class with disposable income, craftsmen who could afford to close their shops for a season, even prosperous peasants who could leave their farms in others' hands. Pilgrimage, once available only to the wealthy or desperately poor, became accessible to a broad middle rank of society. The fourth catalyst was cultural, the development of chivalric ideals and crusading fervour that made military pilgrimage spiritually prestigious. The First Crusade in 1096, calling knights to liberate Jerusalem, created a template where religious devotion and martial valour combined. Santiago, with its legends of St. James appearing on battlefields to slaughter Muslims, offered similar appeal without requiring the extremely dangerous journey to the Holy Land. Knights could make Santiago pilgrimage, pray at an apostle's tomb, contribute to the Reconquista, and return home having proven their devotion and courage. These forces converged in the early 12th century to create what historians call the Golden Age of Santiago pilgrimage. Contemporary records suggest that by 1150, perhaps 500,000 pilgrims per year were walking the various routes that led to Santiago, an almost inconceivable number given medieval population and transportation limitations. Even if these estimates are inflated, the basic fact of massive participation is undeniable. The Camino had become a defining feature of European Christianity, and something nearly every Christian hoped to do at least once in their lifetime. The physical transformation of the pilgrimage route matched its growing popularity. French and Spanish monarchs, recognizing both the spiritual prestige and economic benefit, invested heavily in infrastructure. They built bridges over rivers that had previously required dangerous fording. They paved sections of road through difficult terrain. They established royal hospices to supplement monastic ones. They stationed guards at known bandit locations. They created legal frameworks protecting pilgrims, making assault on a pilgrim a serious crime punishable by death, giving pilgrims exemption from tolls and taxes. Towns along the Camino exploded in size and prosperity. Places that had been small agricultural villages in the year 1000 were thriving commercial centres by 1200. Their economies entirely built around serving pilgrims. They had dozens of inns and taverns, shops selling pilgrim supplies like staffs and water gourds and scallop shells, churches competing to display relics that might attract pilgrims to stop and make donations. The architecture changed too. Towns built or rebuilt in the distinctive Romanesque style that spread along the Camino, round-arched churches with solid stone construction, bell towers visible for miles, cloisters where pilgrims could rest. The Cathedral of Santiago underwent massive reconstruction beginning in 1075. The old 9th century church replaced by a massive Romanesque cathedral designed to accommodate thousands of pilgrims simultaneously. The project took over a century to complete, generations of stonemasons and sculptors working to create a building worthy of an apostle's tomb. The result was one of medieval Europe's architectural masterpieces, vast and solid and inspiring, designed to overwhelm pilgrims who had walked months to reach it, to make them feel they had truly arrived at something sacred and important. The cultural impact extended beyond architecture. The Camino became a highway for ideas, artistic styles, musical traditions, even languages. Pilgrims from Germany walked alongside others from England, France, Italy, Poland, mixing tongues and customs. Musicians travelled the route, spreading songs and instruments from region to region. Artists learned techniques from each other, the Romanesque style itself emerging partly from this cross-pollination. Manuscripts and books travelled the Camino, libraries along the route growing as pilgrims donated texts or monks copied works brought by travellers. The Codex Calixtinus, compiled in the mid-1200s, represents the culmination of this cultural flowering. It was simultaneously devotional text, practical guidebook, architectural description, and cultural commentary, providing pilgrims with everything they needed to know. It included sermons about St. James for reading at various points along the route. It contained the Pseudo-Turpin Chronicle, a legendary account of Charlemagne liberating the pilgrimage road. Most famously, it included Book 5, the Pilgrim's Guide, which described the route from France to Santiago in detail, naming towns and hospices, warning about dangerous river crossings, commenting on local customs and dialects. The guide reveals the 12th century Camino as a thoroughly international experience. It mentions pilgrims from virtually every European region, describes the different languages heard along the way, comments with sometimes harsh judgment on the character of various peoples encountered. The Basques are described as barbarous, the Navarrese as treacherous, though whether these characterizations reflected reality or French prejudice is unclear. What matters is that pilgrimage had become common enough that detailed guidebooks were necessary and economically viable, that enough people were making the journey to support a whole literature around it. The turning point also brought darker changes. The massive flow of pilgrims attracted not just monks and merchants, but criminals and con artists. Bandits organised around targeting pilgrims, some operating in the mountains where victims couldn't easily escape, others disguising themselves as fellow pilgrims to gain trust before attacking. Corrupt officials extorted bribes from pilgrims at border crossings. The very success of the pilgrimage created opportunities for exploitation that hadn't existed when fewer people walked the route. By 1200, Santiago de Compostela had been transformed from a backwater Galician town into one of Christianity's most important cities, rivaling Rome in prestige if not in size or wealth. The Archbishop of Santiago wielded enormous power, controlling vast estates, commanding income from pilgrims and from towns along the route, negotiating with kings as near equal. The tomb itself had become one of medieval Europe's greatest treasures, housed in an increasingly magnificent cathedral, surrounded by legends and miracles attracting the powerful and humble alike. The 12th century established patterns that would continue for centuries, making the Camino an enduring feature of European life rather than a passing enthusiasm. The infrastructure built then, the bridges and hospices and churches, would serve pilgrims for generations. The traditions established, the scallop shell symbol, the pilgrim's blessing, the rituals performed at Santiago would persist through social and religious upheavals. The cultural mixing along the route would continue shaping European identity, creating connections between regions that politics alone would never have forged. The explosive growth of Santiago pilgrimage in the 12th century triggered consequences that rippled across Europe for generations, transforming not just the physical landscape through which pilgrims walked, but the economic, political, and cultural fabric of medieval Christendom itself. Towns that had been subsistence farming communities became commercial hubs. Monasteries that had been isolated, contemplative retreats, became wealthy institutions wielding political power. The very concept of what it meant to be European began shifting, shaped by the shared experience of millions walking the same roads toward the same destination. The most immediate consequence was economic. The Camino became one of medieval Europe's most important commercial arteries, second only to the great trade routes connecting northern and southern Europe through the Alpine passes. Pilgrims needed food, shelter, supplies, and they carried money from their home regions to spend along the way. A German pilgrim might bring silver coins from Hamburg, spend them in French villages. Those coins would circulate to Spain, return north through merchant networks, creating a constant flow of currency that lubricated commerce across the continent. Towns strategically located along the Camino grew wealthy beyond what their agricultural production alone could support. Burgos, which in the year 1000 had been a minor fortified settlement, became a major city by 1200, its economy built primarily on serving pilgrims and the merchants who followed the same routes. Leon, Pamplona, Logroño, all exploded in population and prosperity. Their markets sold not just to locals but to the constant stream of travellers passing through, creating demand for specialised goods and services that wouldn't exist in isolated communities. The architectural transformation was stunning. Towns competed to build the most impressive churches, partly from genuine devotion but also from pragmatic recognition that pilgrims would stop at places with beautiful churches, would make donations, would spend money. The distinctive Romanesque churches that still line the Camino, with their round arches and solid stone construction and elaborate sculptural programs, were advertisements as much as houses of worship, statements that this town was prosperous and important, worth visiting. Hospices evolved from simple shelters into complex institutions. The great pilgrimage hospices of the 12th and 13th centuries were more like hospitals in the modern sense, with permanent staff, medical facilities, kitchens capable of feeding hundreds daily, dormitories segregated by sex, chapels for services, administrative offices managing extensive landholdings donated by pious benefactors. The Hospital de San Marcos in León, founded in 1152, eventually became one of Europe's most important charitable institutions. Its wealth derived from donations and its mission expanded to include caring for the local poor, not just pilgrims. The medical consequences were significant and double-edged. Pilgrimage routes became vectors for disease transmission, bringing together people from across Europe in close quarters, sharing dormitories and water sources, creating ideal conditions for epidemics. Outbreaks of plague, cholera, typhus spread along the Camino faster than through ordinary population movement. But the hospices also became centres for medical knowledge, places where practitioners shared techniques, where experience treating thousands of patients from different regions led to improved understanding of disease and treatment. The medical traditions developed along the Camino influenced European medicine broadly. Politically, the Camino strengthened certain kingdoms while weakening others. The Christian kingdoms of northern Spain, through whose territories the main routes passed, gained enormous prestige and revenue. Kings of Castile, Leon, Navarre all promoted the pilgrimage actively, knowing it brought not just spiritual glory but hard currency and international recognition. They competed to provide the best roads, the most efficient river crossings, the safest passage, each trying to route as many pilgrims as possible through their territories rather than their rivals. The pilgrimage also created unexpected diplomatic channels. Nobles from different kingdoms met along the Camino, shared meals in hospices, prayed together at shrines, formed relationships that transcended political boundaries. These personal connections sometimes prevented wars or facilitated peace negotiations. A French count who had walked to Santiago with a Castilian knight had reason to think twice before supporting military action against Castile. The Camino created a kind of informal European unity based on shared experience, a counterweight to the constant political fragmentation. But there were costs too, consequences that church authorities preferred not to emphasize. The concentration of wealth in pilgrimage towns created resentment in surrounding rural areas that saw little benefit from the streams of pilgrims passing through. Peasants resented roads and bridges built with their labour and taxes that primarily served travellers rather than locals. Some communities along the Camino grew dependent on pilgrimage revenue, their economies dangerously unbalanced, vulnerable to any disruption in pilgrim flow. Crime increased dramatically along popular routes. Professional bandit gangs organised specifically to prey on pilgrims, setting ambushes in mountain passes, bribing local officials to look the other way, sometimes operating openly because they outnumbered any law enforcement presence. The most notorious was the stretch through the Pyrenees, where pilgrims were regularly robbed and murdered despite the presence of hospices and monasteries. The problem got bad enough that military orders, knights sworn to protect pilgrims, established outposts along the route, but they could never fully suppress the banditry. The cultural consequences were perhaps most profound and lasting. The Camino became a highway for ideas, artistic styles, architectural techniques, even languages. French became a lingua franca along the route, spoken by pilgrims from different regions who needed a common tongue. This helped standardize French, giving it prestige and utility beyond France itself. Similarly, the Galician Portuguese spoken around Santiago influenced pilgrims who brought words and phrases home with them, contributing to linguistic evolution across Europe. Music and poetry spread along the Camino too. The troubadour tradition, songs of courtly love and heroic deeds, travelled the route from southern France into Spain and back north again, evolving as different cultures adapted it. The Cantigas de Santa Maria, a 13th century collection of songs in Galician Portuguese, includes many references to Santiago pilgrimage, preserving melodies and verses that pilgrims sang while walking. These musical traditions, mixing influences from across Europe, helped create what we might recognise as the first pan-European popular culture. Religious consequences extended beyond increased devotion to St. James. The pilgrimage exposed people to different Christian practices, different liturgical traditions, different ways of being Catholic. A German pilgrim attending Mass in a Spanish monastery might encounter unfamiliar hymns or rituals, then bring those practices home. This circulation of religious customs helped standardize certain elements of Catholic practice while also preserving regional variations, creating the complex tapestry of medieval Christianity that was simultaneously universal and intensely local. The Camino also became a kind of university without walls, a place where knowledge spread informally through conversation and observation. A scholar walking to Santiago might discuss Aristotelian philosophy with a monk from a different monastery, exchanging interpretations and arguments over days of walking together. A craftsman might observe techniques in towns along the way that he could adapt in his home workshop. An architect might sketch churches he saw, noting features to incorporate in future buildings. This informal knowledge transfer, multiplied across millions of pilgrims over centuries, accelerated cultural and technological development. The social consequences were equally significant. Pilgrimage created opportunities for social mobility, ways for common people to gain status and recognition. A peasant who completed the journey to Santiago earned respect, was listened to with new attention, had authority derived from that experience. Pilgrimage stories became valuable social currency. entertainment in communities with little access to books or professional entertainers. Someone who had walked to Santiago could hold an audience for hours describing what they had seen and experienced. For women particularly, pilgrimage offered rare opportunities for independence and authority. A woman who had walked to Santiago commanded respect, had proven herself capable of enduring hardship and completing a difficult journey. Some women used this earned status to resist arranged marriages, to negotiate better terms with family members, even to pursue religious vocations. The widow of a wealthy merchant might use her pilgrimage credentials to justify living semi-independently, managing her late husband's business rather than remarrying as family pressure demanded. The consequence that perhaps mattered most, though it would take centuries to fully manifest, was the creation of a shared European identity. Before the medieval pilgrimage boom, most people identified with their local region, their town or valley, perhaps their kingdom. The concept of Christendom existed but remained abstract. Walking the Camino made it concrete, put German pilgrims in conversation with Italian ones, made French travellers dependent on Spanish hospitality, forced English pilgrims to navigate Basque territory. This direct experience of Europe's diversity within shared Christian framework created a sense of belonging to something larger than local loyalties, a consciousness that would eventually evolve into modern European identity. The legacy of medieval Santiago pilgrimage extends far beyond those who walked it, reaching forward through centuries to shape how we think about travel, spirituality, cultural exchange, and the very concept of Europe itself. The patterns established along the Camino, the infrastructure built to serve it, the social and cultural consequences of millions making the journey, left marks on Western civilization that remain visible today if you know where to look. The most obvious legacy is physical. The churches and hospices and bridges that still stand along the pilgrimage route, many still serving their original functions 800 or 900 years later. The Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela remains one of Spain's most visited sites, its Romanesque architecture testament to medieval ambition and skill. The countless smaller churches dotting the Camino, many in tiny villages that otherwise would have warranted only simple wooden structures, represent a permanent upgrading of rural religious infrastructure driven by pilgrimage traffic. The roads themselves, or at least their routes, persist. Modern highways through northern Spain often follow paths established in the Middle Ages to accommodate pilgrims, paths that followed earlier Roman roads, creating continuity of travel routes stretching back 2,000 years. The bridges, many rebuilt or reinforced over centuries, still carry traffic across rivers that once threatened to drown pilgrims. Some are still called Puente de los Peregrinos, Bridge of the Pilgrims, preserving their original purpose in their names. But the deeper impact was cultural and conceptual, ways medieval pilgrimage shaped how Western civilization thinks about movement, purpose, and transformation. The Camino helped establish the idea that travel itself could be spiritually meaningful, that the journey mattered as much as the destination. This was a significant conceptual shift from earlier Christian thinking that viewed the body and physical world as obstacles to spiritual development. Pilgrimage made the body's movement, its suffering and endurance, into a path toward God rather than away from God. This sanctification of travel influenced later exploration and expansion. When European explorers began sailing to distant continents in the 15th and 16th centuries, they framed their journeys partly in pilgrimage terms, describing themselves as carrying Christianity to new lands, their voyages as spiritual quests as much as commercial ventures. Christopher Columbus, a deeply religious man who had likely made pilgrimage to Santiago, saw his Atlantic crossing through that lens, the journey itself as form of devotion, discovery as revelation. The Camino also established tourism infrastructure and the economic model for it. The medieval hospices, inns, guidebooks, souvenir vendors, all created a template for serving travellers that evolved into modern tourism. The scallop shell badges that pilgrims purchased became perhaps history's first mass-produced souvenirs, cheap mementos that proved you had been somewhere important. The practice of collecting tokens from places visited, now expressed through t-shirts and postcards and refrigerator magnets, has direct lineage to medieval pilgrimage badges. The guidebook tradition pioneered by texts like the Codex Calixtinus evolved into modern travel literature. The Pilgrim's Guide section, with its practical advice about roads and accommodations and local customs, its warnings about dangers and recommendations for worthy stops, established the template that travel guides still follow. Modern writers describing the best hotels or warning about tourist traps are heirs to the 12th century monks, who warned pilgrims about dishonest innkeepers and praised hospices that treated travellers well. Linguistically, the impact was substantial. Words related to pilgrimage entered multiple European languages and often expanded beyond religious contexts. The Spanish word romero, originally meaning pilgrim, came to mean traveller more generally. The French pèlerin and Italian pellegrino similarly broadened in meaning. The English word travel itself may derive from travail, the suffering and labour associated with difficult journeys like pilgrimage. The connection between movement and hardship, journey and transformation, embedded in these linguistic shifts reflects pilgrimage's cultural influence. The scallop shell became one of history's most widely recognised symbols, its association with Santiago so strong that it appears in art and architecture across Europe, in contexts having nothing to do with pilgrimage. It decorates churches that pilgrims never visited, appears in noble family crests, shows up in Renaissance paintings as symbol of journeying or seeking. The Shell Oil Company's logo, while not directly derived from Santiago, participates in a symbolic tradition the pilgrimage made ubiquitous. More abstractly, the Camino influenced European concepts of community and mutual aid. The hospice system, where strangers cared for travellers without expectation of payment simply because those travellers were Christians on sacred journeys, modelled a kind of society based on solidarity rather than purely economic exchange. This ideal, however imperfectly realised in practice, influenced later thinking about social welfare, charity, and the obligations of the wealthy toward the poor. The pilgrimage hospices were arguably medieval Europe's most extensive social welfare programme. The musical and artistic legacy is equally significant. The Romanesque style, while not invented by the pilgrimage, spread along the Camino and became associated with it, creating architectural unity across regions that otherwise had little in common. A church in Germany and one in Spain, built in the same period for pilgrims, share far more stylistic features than geography alone would suggest. This architectural language, understood across linguistic and political boundaries, helped create visual coherence to Christian Europe. The Camino's role in spreading ideas influenced intellectual history too. Universities were just beginning to form in the 12th century when Santiago pilgrimage reached its peak, and the informal knowledge exchange along the pilgrimage routes complemented formal academic development. Scholars travelling to Santiago carried manuscripts, debated philosophy with other educated pilgrims, encountered perspectives different from their home institutions. This intellectual cross-pollination accelerated the recovery and dissemination of classical texts, contributed to the 12th century Renaissance that transformed European thought. The impact on Spanish identity and history was particularly profound. The Camino helped define Christian Spain as distinct from Muslim Iberia, creating a geographic and cultural corridor connecting the Christian north to broader European civilization. The pilgrimage routes became, in effect, the front lines of the Reconquista, paths along which not just pilgrims but soldiers, supplies and ideas flowed. Towns along the Camino were where European and Spanish Christian identity merged, where French and German pilgrims encountered Spanish culture, and where Spaniards absorbed influences from beyond the Pyrenees. This cultural exchange worked both directions. Pilgrims returning north from Santiago brought Spanish and Galician influences home with them, musical styles, architectural features, even foods and recipes. The cross-fertilization helped break down the relative isolation of different European regions, creating networks of influence that operated independently of royal diplomacy or church hierarchy. A German town might adopt a building technique observed along the Camino, or a French monastery might incorporate Galician hymns into its liturgy, these small adoptions accumulating into genuine cultural synthesis. The modern revival of the Camino, beginning in the late 20th century, demonstrates the pilgrimage's enduring appeal, even in secular contexts. Thousands now walk the route annually, who have no particular religious commitment, but are drawn by the same things that attracted medieval pilgrims: the challenge of the journey, the transformation through physical ordeal. The community found among fellow travellers the simplicity of walking day after day toward a clear destination. The medieval pilgrimage created a template for meaningful travel that remains compelling after centuries. The spiritual legacy extends beyond Christianity. The Camino influenced how other religious traditions think about pilgrimage, offering a model that combines personal transformation with communal experience, individual suffering with mutual support, local shrines with universal significance. The concept of pilgrimage as journey, rather than just visitation of a holy site, the idea that the walking itself matters spiritually, this emphasis owes much to the Santiago example. Perhaps most fundamentally, medieval Santiago pilgrimage helped create the idea of Europe as a cultural entity, a space defined not by political borders, but by shared practices and values. A merchant in Krakow and a peasant in Portugal might have nothing else in common, but if both had walked to Santiago, they shared an experience that transcended their differences, a common reference point that created connection across vast distances and social chasms. This Europe of pilgrims, united by movement and devotion, prefigured the political and economic unions that would emerge centuries later. Behind the grand architecture and theological debates and economic statistics lie the individual pilgrims themselves, the millions of people who actually walked the Camino over the centuries, whose names are mostly lost but whose collective experience shaped what the pilgrimage became. These were not abstract medieval Christians, but specific human beings with hopes and fears, suffering bodies and complicated motivations, people who made decisions day by day about how far to walk, whether to help a struggling fellow pilgrim, whether the journey was worth continuing when every step brought pain. We know some by name from the few personal accounts that survive. Hermann König of Vach, a German monk who walked to Santiago around 1490 and wrote a detailed guidebook afterward, describing not just the route, but his feelings along it, moments of despair in mountain passes, joy at reaching important shrines, irritation with dishonest innkeepers. His account reveals a practical, somewhat cynical man who nonetheless completed the journey and found it meaningful enough to help others do the same. Nompart de Caumont, a French nobleman who made pilgrimage in 1417, kept a diary that survives, offering glimpses of pilgrimage from an aristocratic perspective. He travelled with servants, stayed in better accommodations than common pilgrims could afford, but still walked the same roads, visited the same churches, experienced the same fundamental journey. His observations about the places he passed through, the people he met, the local customs he found strange or admirable, provide window into how medieval people perceived difference and similarity across European regions. But for every pilgrim whose name we know, thousands remain anonymous, their presence recorded only in hospice ledgers noting how many were sheltered on a given night, or in archaeological evidence of objects lost or discarded along the route. These nameless pilgrims were the real Camino, the mass of ordinary people for whom the journey represented the most significant event of their lives. Consider Maria, a name we'll give to an anonymous woman who walked to Santiago in the 1200s, one of countless peasant pilgrims whose individual stories are lost but whose collective experience we can reconstruct from various sources. She might have been from a village in southern France, daughter of farmers, married young to a man from the same village, bearing children who mostly died in infancy as was common then. Perhaps she made pilgrimage after a particularly devastating loss, a child who lived long enough to be named and loved before dying of some illness medieval medicine couldn't treat. She would have needed permission from her husband to go. This wasn't a journey women undertook lightly or without male approval in most cases. She would have saved for months or years to afford the journey, setting aside small amounts from selling eggs or cheese, hiding coins where her husband wouldn't find and spend them. She would have sewn a simple cloak, acquired or borrowed a staff, arranged for neighbours to help with farm work in her absence. The preparations themselves would have taken on ritual significance. Each object gathered another step toward transformation. The first days of walking would have been hardest physically, her body not yet accustomed to the demands of covering 20 or more miles daily. Blisters would have formed and burst and formed again, feet swelling painfully in rough shoes. Her legs would have ached in ways she'd never experienced, muscles protesting effort beyond what farm work required. She would have wondered if she could continue, if this suffering was what God wanted, if she should turn back before getting too far from home. But she would have met other pilgrims, perhaps joining a small group for safety and company. There might have been a merchant from Toulouse, worldly and talkative, telling stories of distant places he had traded. A young man doing penance for some crime he wouldn't specify, walking in chains, silent and brooding. An older woman, widow of a knight, who had promised her dying husband she would pray for him at Santiago. These temporary companions would have become intensely important, their shared suffering creating bonds that peacetime village life rarely generated. The nights in hospices would have been revelatory for someone who had never travelled beyond her village, sleeping in large rooms with dozens of strangers, hearing languages she couldn't understand, seeing clothes and customs different from anything she knew. Some hospices served better food than she ate at home, simple but plentiful, while others offered only bread and water. She would have learned to recognise good hospices by reputation, to avoid places known for theft or poor conditions. This knowledge passed between pilgrims like valuable currency. She would have witnessed miracles, or what seemed like miracles. A crippled man walking better after praying at a particular shrine, a sick child recovering after drinking water from a holy well. Whether these were genuine divine interventions or natural recoveries or wishful thinking hardly mattered. They reinforced her faith that the journey meant something, that St. James was real and active and responsive to prayers. She would have faced dangers too. Crossing rivers swollen by spring rains, the water threatening to sweep her away, walking through forests where bandits were known to hide, clutching her staff and praying to every saint she could name, suffering through illness, fever and dysentery that left her weak and vulnerable, dependent on the kindness of strangers who might or might not choose to help. Some of her fellow pilgrims would have died along the way, buried in foreign soil, their families never knowing exactly where they rested. The arrival at Santiago after months of walking would have overwhelmed her. The cathedral, larger than any building she'd ever seen, filled with light from windows she couldn't imagine how anyone had made. The crowds of pilgrims from across Europe, the priests conducting masses in languages she didn't know, the tomb itself where an apostle supposedly rested. She would have wept, whether from relief or exhaustion or genuine spiritual experience or all three together. The return journey would have been different, her body now strong from months of walking, the route familiar, the goal behind rather than ahead. She would have carried a scallop shell as proof of completion, worn proudly where everyone could see. She might have brought small items purchased in Santiago, a simple pilgrim badge for herself, perhaps a shell for her husband or surviving children. These objects would become her most precious possessions, physical evidence of the greatest thing she had ever done. When Maria returned to her village, she would have been changed, not necessarily in dramatic ways, but in small shifts of confidence and perspective. She had survived months away from everything familiar. She had seen great cities and beautiful churches and landscape completely different from home. She had met people from across Europe and realized that despite different languages and customs, they were fundamentally similar to her, sharing the same hopes and fears. This expanded worldview, however limited by modern standards, was revolutionary for a peasant woman who otherwise would never have travelled beyond the nearest market town. She would have told her story many times to family and neighbours, the tale growing more polished with each retelling, certain episodes emphasised, others forgotten. She would have become someone people consulted about travel, about distant places, someone whose opinion carried new weight. The pilgrimage would define her for the rest of her life, the thing she had done that set her apart, that proved she was more than just another peasant wife and mother. Multiply Maria by millions. Imagine all the individual stories, all the private reasons for walking, all the personal transformations large and small, and you begin to grasp what the Camino actually was beyond statistics and architecture. It was countless human beings choosing to suffer in pursuit of something they couldn't quite name, hoping the walking would change them in ways that staying home never could. Not everyone embraced Santiago pilgrimage with enthusiasm, and the obstacles pilgrims faced came not just from geography and weather, but from people who actively opposed, exploited, or simply resented the massive movement of travellers across their lands. These opposing forces, ranging from bandits and corrupt officials to skeptical intellectuals and rival religious centres, shaped the pilgrimage as profoundly as its promoters did, creating the conflicts and challenges that gave the journey meaning beyond mere travel. The most dangerous opposition came from bandits, organised criminals who saw pilgrims as perfect targets, travellers carrying money and goods far from home, where their deaths or robberies would never be investigated. The mountain passes through the Pyrenees were particularly notorious, narrow paths where small groups of armed men could easily ambush larger numbers of pilgrims who were mostly unarmed or poorly equipped for fighting. These weren't desperate men driven to crime by poverty, but professional thieves who made good livings preying on the faithful. Some bandit gangs operated with tacit approval or even protection from local lords who shared in the profits. A noble with territory along the Camino might officially condemn banditry while privately allowing certain gangs to operate in exchange for a cut of their take. This corruption was so widespread that church authorities, in their efforts to protect pilgrims, had to negotiate not just with bandits but with the political powers that sheltered them. The negotiations sometimes included offering amnesty to bandits who would switch sides and protect pilgrims instead, turning poachers into gamekeepers. The military orders established to combat this threat, particularly the Knights of Santiago founded in 1170, represented the Church's armed response to violence along the Camino. These were warrior monks, men who took religious vows but also trained for combat, specifically to defend pilgrims and fight the bandits who preyed on them. They built fortified hospices in the most dangerous areas, essentially castles where pilgrims could find refuge, and they patrolled the routes with enough force to deter most attacks. But even the military orders couldn't eliminate banditry entirely. The landscape was too vast, the routes too numerous, the rewards too tempting. Pilgrims continued being robbed and murdered throughout the medieval period, the danger accepted as part of the pilgrimage experience, another form of suffering to be endured in pursuit of salvation. Some pilgrims travelled in large groups specifically for protection, safety in numbers compensating for individual vulnerability. Corrupt innkeepers and merchants represented a different kind of opposition, people who saw pilgrims not as fellow Christians deserving charity, but as opportunities for profit. The Codex Calixtinus contains bitter warnings about specific towns where innkeepers watered wine, served rotten food, charged outrageous prices, and sometimes drugged or robbed guests who trusted them. These warnings persisted in pilgrim guides for centuries, suggesting the problem was chronic and difficult to control despite church condemnation and occasional secular prosecution. Some communities along the Camino actively resented the pilgrimage and the disruption it brought. Peasants saw roads built with their labour that primarily benefited travellers passing through. They watched resources flow toward hospices and churches while their own villages remained poor. They resented being forced to provide free labour, maintaining bridges and roads that pilgrims used but locals had no particular need for. This resentment sometimes manifested in hostility toward pilgrims, overcharging them at markets, refusing assistance, even violence against stragglers who couldn't defend themselves. Local priests sometimes opposed pilgrimage too, though for different reasons. They saw their parishioners spending money travelling to Santiago that could have been donated to local churches. They worried about peasants leaving farms at crucial seasons, disrupting agricultural cycles. They noticed that people who completed pilgrimage sometimes returned with ideas and practices learned along the way that conflicted with local religious customs, threatening the priest's authority. Some clerics preached against pilgrimage, arguing that true devotion didn't require travel, that praying at home served God just as well. Intellectual opposition came from scholars who questioned whether pilgrimage was theologically sound. Some argued that it encouraged the wrong kind of religious thinking, the belief that salvation could be earned through physical actions rather than through grace and faith. Others worried that pilgrimage distracted from more important spiritual disciplines like prayer, fasting, and contemplation. A few pointed out the obvious opportunities for sin along the pilgrimage routes, the temptations of alehouses and brothels, the pride that came from being able to claim you had walked to Santiago. These intellectual critics, mostly concentrated in universities and monasteries distant from the Camino itself, wrote treatises arguing that pilgrimage represented a misunderstanding of Christian theology. They cited church fathers who had emphasized inner spiritual transformation over external demonstrations of piety. They noted that nowhere in the Bible did Jesus command his followers to make pilgrimages, that the apostles hadn't established the practice, that it seemed more derived from pagan customs than authentic Christianity. The church hierarchy responded to these criticisms defensively, issuing proclamations affirming the spiritual value of pilgrimage, granting indulgences to those who completed it, essentially doubling down on promoting something that clearly worked, in terms of engaging popular devotion even if it raised theological questions. The debate revealed tension between official theology and popular practice, between what learned clerics thought Christianity should be and what ordinary believers actually found meaningful. Muslim authorities in Spain represented the most obvious political opposition. They controlled much of the Iberian Peninsula during the Camino's peak centuries and viewed the Christian pilgrimage route as a symbol of their enemies' persistence and strength. Some Muslim leaders contemplated destroying Santiago entirely, eliminating the shrine that so clearly motivated Christian resistance to Muslim rule. Almanzor's raid in 997 that damaged the cathedral represented the high point of this policy, an attempt to deal a demoralizing blow to Christian Spain. But Muslim opposition was complicated by practical considerations. The pilgrimage route passed through Christian territories in the north, where Muslim armies couldn't easily reach. Attacks on pilgrims risked provoking Christian military response, and some Muslim rulers recognized that they benefited economically from pilgrims who had to pass through or near Muslim-controlled regions, buying supplies and paying tolls. The relationship between Muslim authorities and Christian pilgrimage was more complex than simple opposition, mixing hostility with pragmatic accommodation. Protestant reformers in the 16th century represented the most devastating opposition the pilgrimage would face. They rejected the entire concept of earning salvation through works, including pilgrimage, arguing that only faith in Christ mattered. They condemned the veneration of saints and relics as idolatry, questioned whether the bones in Santiago were genuinely those of an apostle, and encouraged people to stop wasting time and money on meaningless travel. In Protestant regions of Europe, pilgrimage to Santiago essentially ended, and even in Catholic areas it declined dramatically as the intellectual and religious climate shifted. Within Spain itself, there was always tension between different regions competing for pilgrimage traffic and the revenue it generated. Cities not on the main Camino routes promoted alternative paths that would bring pilgrims through their territories. Local saints' shrines tried to position themselves as worthy stops along the way to Santiago, or even as destinations valuable enough that pilgrims might choose them instead. This competition sometimes turned hostile, with different factions spreading negative stories about rivals, claiming superior miracles, trying to redirect the flow of pilgrims for economic advantage. All this opposition, whether from criminals, skeptics, economic rivals, or theological critics, forced the pilgrimage's defenders to constantly justify and adapt the practice. They had to make the routes safer, regulate hospices and merchants more carefully, articulate better theological arguments for why pilgrimage mattered. In a strange way, the opposition strengthened the pilgrimage by forcing it to evolve, to address legitimate criticisms, to improve conditions for pilgrims. The Camino survived not despite resistance, but partly because of it, shaped by challenges into something more resilient than it might otherwise have been. The 13th century marked a creative and intellectual flowering along the Camino de Santiago, as the infrastructure built in previous generations reached maturity and the cultural exchange facilitated by the pilgrimage began producing visible fruits. This wasn't Renaissance in the later Italian sense of classical revival, but rather an awakening of artistic and intellectual energy across northern Spain and southern France, driven by the collision of different traditions and the patronage that pilgrimage wealth enabled. The Camino became not just a highway for travellers but a cultural laboratory, where ideas and artistic styles mixed and evolved. The architectural expression of this awakening was the transition from Romanesque to Gothic along the pilgrimage route. The great churches built in the 11th and 12th centuries had been solid, heavy, dominated by round arches and thick walls necessary to support stone roofs. But as engineering knowledge improved and spread through the network of craftsmen working on churches along the Camino, builders began experimenting with pointed arches that distributed weight more efficiently, with flying buttresses that allowed walls to be thinner and pierced with larger windows, with ribbed vaulting that created soaring interior spaces flooded with light. The Cathedral of Burgos, begun in 1221, exemplifies this Gothic flowering. It was built to impress pilgrims, to demonstrate that Castile could match or exceed anything being built in France where Gothic had originated. The cathedral's architects, some French, some Spanish, some from other regions, collaborated to create something that synthesized different traditions. The floor plan followed French Gothic models, but decorative elements incorporated Spanish Mudejar influences borrowed from Islamic architecture, while sculptural programs drew on both local and imported craftsmen. The result was distinctively international, recognizably Gothic but also uniquely Spanish, the kind of creative fusion that could only happen in a place where different cultures intersected regularly. This architectural synthesis extended beyond grand cathedrals to smaller churches and secular buildings along the Camino. Towns competed to build beautiful plazas and town halls worthy of the pilgrims passing through. Wealthy merchants and minor nobility commissioned elaborate residences decorated with carved stone facades. Even ordinary buildings showed increased attention to aesthetics, the accumulated wealth from pilgrimage allowing communities to invest in beauty beyond pure functionality. The musical awakening was equally profound. The Camino became a highway for musical traditions, carrying melodies and forms from northern Europe into Spain and back again. The troubadour and trouvère traditions, secular songs of love and adventure, travelled the routes alongside religious music. Pilgrims sang as they walked, sharing songs from their home regions, learning new ones from fellow travellers. This oral transmission of music across linguistic and cultural boundaries created hybrid forms that wouldn't have emerged in isolated communities. The Cantigas de Santa Maria, compiled by King Alfonso X of Castile in the late 1300s, preserves some of this musical richness. Though focused on miracles of the Virgin Mary rather than St. James, the collection includes numerous songs about pilgrimage, many set to melodies that show clear influences from across Europe. Some cantigas use Galician Portuguese lyrics sung to French-influenced tunes. Others incorporate Moorish musical elements, the melodic patterns and rhythmic structures of Islamic Spain, demonstrating how even religious Christian music absorbed influences from Muslim culture through the complex interactions along pilgrimage routes. Monastic scriptoria along the Camino became centres for manuscript production, not just copying religious texts, but also creating illuminated books that ranked among medieval Europe's finest artistic achievements. The wealth brought by pilgrims allowed monasteries to support scribes and illuminators, to import expensive pigments and gold leaf, to dedicate resources to creating beautiful books. These manuscripts circulated along the pilgrimage network, influencing artistic styles across regions, spreading techniques and aesthetic preferences. The literary awakening produced pilgrimage narratives, guidebooks, and devotional poetry, but also stimulated broader literary production. The epic tradition, songs of heroes and battles, flourished along the Camino. The Song of Roland, celebrating Charlemagne's rearguard commander, who supposedly died defending pilgrims at Roncesvalles, became one of medieval Europe's most popular poems, recited in French, translated into other languages, inspiring imitators across the continent. Whether the historical Roland had anything to do with pilgrimage protection was irrelevant. The story became associated with the Camino and helped create a mythology around it. Dante Alighieri, writing in the early 1400s, used pilgrimage to Santiago as metaphor in his Divine Comedy, suggesting that by his time the Camino had become so culturally embedded that Italian readers would immediately understand references to it. When Dante describes souls as pilgrims journeying toward God, he's drawing on imagery that Santiago pilgrimage made universally recognizable. The physical journey to St. James's tomb had become a symbol for spiritual journey more broadly, the walking toward salvation that every Christian undertook whether they literally travelled to Spain or not. Intellectual exchange along the Camino contributed to the recovery and dissemination of classical knowledge that characterized the 12th and 13th century Renaissance. Scholars travelling to Santiago encountered colleagues from other regions, learned about manuscripts available in distant libraries, arranged for texts to be copied and sent to their home institutions. The informal scholarly network that operated along the pilgrimage routes complemented the formal university system beginning to develop in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Some of this intellectual exchange involved Muslim learning, knowledge preserved in Islamic Spain that was being translated into Latin and made available to Christian scholars. Towns along the Camino, particularly those near the Muslim-Christian frontier, became contact points where translations circulated, where scholars could acquire Arabic scientific and philosophical texts. The pilgrimage thus facilitated not just Christian cultural unity, but also the transmission of knowledge across religious boundaries. The artistic awakening extended to sculpture, particularly the elaborate stone carvings that decorated church facades along the Camino. The Portico de la Gloria at Santiago Cathedral, completed in 1188, set a standard for sculptural programs that influenced generations of subsequent carvers. Its three doorways presented complex theological themes through hundreds of individual figures, prophets and apostles and angels carved with remarkable naturalism and emotional expressiveness. Pilgrims arriving at Santiago encountered this artistic masterpiece and carried visual memories of it back home, influencing what they expected churches to look like. Secular arts flourished too. funded by merchant wealth accumulated through serving pilgrims. Tapestries, metalwork, jewellery all showed increased sophistication along the Camino as craftsmen had access to broader markets and more diverse influences. A silversmith in Burgos might learn techniques from a pilgrim who had trained in Paris or Cologne, then adapt those methods to create distinctive local styles. This artistic cross-pollination enriched material culture across the regions the Camino connected. The awakening also had intellectual dimensions beyond art and architecture. Universities were beginning to form, and towns along the Camino established studia or schools that attracted students from across Europe. Salamanca, while not directly on the main Camino route, benefited from its proximity to draw students and teachers who travelled the pilgrimage network. These educational institutions, while never rivaling Paris or Bologna, contributed to spreading literacy and learning beyond traditional monastic centres. Medical knowledge advanced through the hospices where practitioners treating thousands of patients from different regions gained experience that informed broader medical understanding. Practitioners shared observations about disease patterns, treatments that worked or failed, surgical techniques. This practical medical knowledge, though not scientific in modern terms, represented real advancement over earlier medieval practice, and it spread along the Camino as trained practitioners moved between hospices or returned home to apply what they had learned. The cultural awakening wasn't uniform or uninterrupted. Wars still devastated regions along the Camino. Plague outbreaks killed pilgrims and local populations alike. Economic downturns reduced pilgrim numbers and therefore the wealth available for cultural patronage. But overall, the 13th and 14th centuries saw the pilgrimage at its cultural zenith, when the infrastructure was mature, the routes well established, and the creative energy generated by centuries of exchange produced tangible results in art, architecture, music, and intellectual life. The deepest truth about Santiago pilgrimage, the revelation that emerges only after examining its history from every angle, is that the question of whether St. James actually rests in Galicia misses the point entirely. The pilgrimage's power never depended on the authenticity of the bones beneath the cathedral altar. It worked, it transformed lives and cultures and the shape of Europe itself, because of what it represented and enabled rather than because of what physical remains might or might not be present at the destination. This is difficult truth for modern minds trained to value empirical accuracy above symbolic meaning. We want to know if the relics are real, if the legend is true, as though answering that question would somehow resolve the significance of the phenomenon. But medieval pilgrims, whatever they professed to believe about the bones, were responding to something deeper than a specific apostle's physical presence. They were responding to the human need for transformation through ordeal, for community through shared suffering, for meaning through purposeful movement toward a goal that represented something beyond itself. Consider what the pilgrimage actually required. Months of walking, blistered feet bleeding through worn shoes, exhaustion that made every step an act of will, hunger when food ran short, cold in mountain passes, heat on exposed plains, the constant low-level fear of bandits or accident or illness. This was suffering deliberately chosen, pain accepted voluntarily in pursuit of something believers couldn't quite articulate but desperately needed. The suffering itself was the point, not because medieval Christianity was masochistic, but because they understood something we've largely forgotten, that transformation requires difficulty, that ease produces complacency, while ordeal produces change. The pilgrimage created a temporary community of equals, or near equals, that couldn't exist in ordinary medieval life. A noble and a peasant, walking the same road, sleeping in the same hospice, sharing bread and conversation, developed relationships impossible in their home communities, where rigid social hierarchies governed every interaction. The shared experience of suffering and seeking created bonds that transcended class, nationality, language. This glimpse of a more egalitarian society, however brief, was profoundly subversive, offering a vision of what human community could be when stripped of ordinary social structures. The journey also offered escape from intolerable situations in ways that were socially acceptable. A person trapped in an abusive marriage, drowning in debt, crushed by grief, could announce intention to walk to Santiago and suddenly had permission to leave everything behind. The pilgrimage provided cover for flight that would otherwise be condemned. whether the person ever intended to return, whether they even reached Santiago or disappeared along the way into a new life, the pilgrimage framework made the departure legitimate. This safety valve, this socially acceptable path away from impossible circumstances, served crucial psychological and social functions. The economic reality was that pilgrimage to Santiago redistributed wealth across Europe in ways no other mechanism could. A German pilgrim carried silver north to south. A Spanish merchant carried goods east to west. The constant circulation of people meant constant circulation of money, ideas, technologies. This economic integration, entirely voluntary and driven by religious devotion rather than political coercion, created a more unified European economy than any empire could have imposed. The pilgrimage was, among other things, one of history's most successful trade networks, disguised as religious practice. The cultural exchange was equally significant and equally independent of whether James actually rested in Galicia. Artists from different regions met along the Camino, shared techniques, influenced each other's work. Musicians carried melodies across linguistic boundaries. Architects saw buildings they could study and adapt. This circulation of knowledge and artistic tradition, accelerated by the pilgrimage, helped create a recognizable European culture that transcended regional variations. Whether the destination contained authentic apostolic remains was irrelevant to this cultural synthesis. The pilgrimage also served as a kind of massive ongoing psychotherapy for medieval society, providing outlet for guilt, grief, and spiritual yearning that ordinary religious practice couldn't fully address. People carried profound psychological burdens, trauma from violence witnessed or inflicted, grief from losing children, crushing guilt over sins real or imagined, the act of walking for months, the physical suffering, the ritual of arrival and prayer and return, offered a process for working through these psychological states in ways that sitting in a village church couldn't accomplish. The pilgrimage was therapeutic, independent of its ostensible religious purpose. Modern psychological research on pilgrimage, studying contemporary walkers of the Camino who often have no religious motivation, confirms that the physical act of long-distance walking combined with intentional purpose produces measurable psychological benefits. People report increased sense of meaning, better mental health, stronger feeling of connection to others and to something larger than themselves. If this happens for secular walkers in the 21st century, it certainly happened for medieval pilgrims whose culture primed them to interpret the experience through religious framework. The revelation, then, is that the pilgrimage was never really about James at all. It was about the journey itself, about what happens to human beings when they walk for months with purpose and community and suffering. James provided the excuse, the culturally acceptable reason to undertake the journey, but the transformation came from the walking, not from the destination. The medieval church, whether or not its leaders consciously understood this, was promoting something that worked psychologically and socially and culturally, and the theological justification was secondary to those practical benefits. This doesn't mean medieval pilgrims were cynical, or that they didn't genuinely believe in St. James, and most probably did believe sincerely and deeply. But their belief was enabling rather than causative. It gave them permission to seek transformation through a process that would work, whether the bones were authentic or not. The placebo effect, if we want to call it that, was real in its consequences even if the specific mechanism was illusory. Understanding this allows us to appreciate the pilgrimage on its own terms, rather than judging it by standards of historical accuracy it never claimed to meet. The question isn't whether 9th century Bishop Theodomir found St. James's actual remains. The question is what millions of people over centuries created through their collective belief that he had, what they built and experienced and became through walking toward what they believed was an apostle's tomb. The answer is, they created one of medieval Europe's most important cultural institutions. They transformed landscape and economy and art. They found meaning and community and sometimes healing through deliberately chosen suffering in pursuit of a goal that meant something whether or not it was literally true. This is the deepest historical truth of Santiago pilgrimage, the revelation that emerges after setting aside our modern obsession with empirical accuracy and instead asking what actually happened, what difference the pilgrimage made regardless of the authenticity of its ostensible object. What happened was profound and lasting, a mass movement that shaped a civilization, and it happened because human beings needed it to happen, needed the transformation that the pilgrimage offered, needed the journey more than they needed the destination to be verifiably real. When we stand back from the accumulated centuries of Santiago pilgrimage and ask what it reveals about human nature, about what people need and how they seek it, patterns emerge that transcend the medieval context and speak to something more fundamental about being human. The pilgrimage wasn't just a medieval phenomenon, but an expression of needs that persist across cultures and eras, needs for meaning, for transformation, for community, for the sense that our suffering serves some purpose beyond mere survival. The first thing the pilgrimage reveals is how desperately humans need narrative structure for their lives. We are storytelling creatures who struggle to find meaning in the formless chaos of daily existence. The pilgrimage offered perfect narrative arc, clear beginning when you left home, rising action through the challenges of the journey, climax at Santiago, resolution in the return. This imposed story structure on lives that otherwise felt random and meaningless. A peasant whose days blurred together in endless repetitive farm labour could transform months of that life into a story with shape and purpose and significance. Modern life still shows this hunger for narrative structure. People create bucket lists, set arbitrary goals like running marathons or visiting all 7 continents, precisely because these self-imposed challenges provide the story arc that makes life feel meaningful rather than merely successive. The current popularity of long-distance hiking trails, the thousands who walk the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail each year, many with no religious motivation whatsoever, demonstrates that the human need for transformative journey persists independent of theological framework. The pilgrimage also reveals how much we need difficulty, need to test ourselves against challenges that aren't artificially safe. Modern Western life, for all its comforts, often feels unsatisfying precisely because it's too easy, too cushioned against real hardship. We've eliminated most physical suffering from daily existence, and in doing so, we've also eliminated opportunities for the kind of growth that only comes through difficulty. Medieval pilgrims chose suffering because they understood intuitively that transformation requires ordeal, that you don't become a different person through comfort but through pushing beyond what you think you can endure. This perhaps explains the contemporary appeal of extreme sports, ultramarathons, adventure tourism, all the ways modern people voluntarily seek out difficulty in lives otherwise characterized by ease. We're trying to recover something that medieval pilgrims had naturally, the experience of genuine physical challenge that proves something to ourselves about our capacity to endure. The Camino still offers this, which is why many modern walkers speak of it in language almost identical to what medieval pilgrims might have used, talking about discovering inner strength, learning what they're capable of, being changed by the difficulty itself. The need for community revealed by the pilgrimage is equally profound and equally persistent. Medieval society offered strong local community based on village and family, but that community was also often suffocating, defined by rigid hierarchies and limited horizons. The pilgrimage created temporary communities of choice, people brought together by shared purpose rather than accident of birth. These communities were intense precisely because they were temporary, because everyone knew the bonds formed on the road wouldn't survive return to ordinary life where social differences reasserted themselves. Modern loneliness, the epidemic of disconnection despite or perhaps because of digital connectivity, suggests we've lost something crucial about community formation. We have more ways to stay in touch with more people than ever before, yet rates of reported loneliness keep increasing. The pilgrimage model offers insight into what's missing, the shared physical presence, the common purpose, the bonds formed through mutual vulnerability and assistance. Online communities, however valuable, can't fully replace the experience of walking beside someone for days, sharing bread, helping them when they stumble, being helped when you can't continue. The pilgrimage's emphasis on physical movement toward a goal speaks to something deep in human psychology, the connection between physical journey and psychological transformation. We talk about life as a journey, about moving forward, about paths and directions, not just as metaphors but because spatial movement and personal growth are linked in our minds and bodies. Walking for months toward Santiago didn't just take pilgrims somewhere geographically. It enacted the psychological process of moving from one state to another, from sinner to forgiven, from lost to found, from broken to healed. Contemporary therapy increasingly recognizes the value of physical movement for psychological healing. Walking meditation, forest bathing, adventure therapy that uses wilderness experiences to treat trauma, all draw on the same insight that medieval pilgrims knew intuitively, that moving your body through space, particularly challenging space, facilitates moving your psyche through internal landscapes. The destination matters less than the journey. The transformation happens in the walking, not in the arriving. The pilgrimage also reveals how humans need ritual, need formalized processes for marking transitions and seeking transformation. We are ritual creatures who struggle without ceremonial structures to help us navigate life's changes and crises. Medieval Christianity offered elaborate ritual frameworks, and pilgrimage was among the most powerful, a months-long ritual that transformed participants through enacted symbolism and physical ordeal. The decline of traditional religious ritual in modern secular society has left many people without access to these transformative ceremonial structures. This absence helps explain the proliferation of secular rituals around wellness, self-improvement, mindfulness, all the ways contemporary people try to create formalized processes for personal transformation. These often seem shallow or commercialized precisely because they lack the depth and danger that made medieval pilgrimage effective. Walking to Santiago while knowing you might die along the way created stakes that a weekend wellness retreat can never match. Real transformation requires real risk, and perhaps we've made our lives so safe that genuine transformation has become correspondingly difficult. The economic dimension of the pilgrimage, the way it redistributed wealth and created trade networks, reveals something about how human cooperation and exchange work best. The pilgrimage wasn't imposed by authority, but emerged organically from individuals making personal choices that collectively created massive economic impact. This bottom-up organization, driven by genuine human needs and desires, rather than top-down planning, created resilient networks that adapted and persisted for centuries. There's a lesson here about the limits of centralized control and the power of allowing people to organize around what they actually find meaningful. The cross-cultural exchange facilitated by pilgrimage demonstrates human capacity for learning and adapting across boundaries. Pilgrims encountered different languages, customs, foods, architectural styles, and rather than rejecting these differences, they absorbed and adapted them, carrying influences back home that enriched their own cultures. This openness to foreign influence, this ability to appreciate and learn from difference while maintaining distinct identity, seems particularly relevant in our current moment of rising nationalism and cultural defensiveness. Medieval pilgrims managed something we struggle with today. They maintained strong local and religious identities while also embracing a cosmopolitan outlook developed through travel and encounter with others. A French pilgrim could be proudly French and devoutly Catholic, while also appreciating Spanish architecture and learning from German fellow travellers. This both and, rather than the either-or approach to identity and culture, might offer a useful model for navigating contemporary globalization. Perhaps most fundamentally, the pilgrimage reveals human capacity for faith in the broadest sense, the ability to commit to something uncertain in hope of transformation. Whether the bones were authentic, whether the miracles were real, whether walking those particular roads would actually earn divine favour, all of it was uncertain, resting on faith rather than proof. And yet millions walked anyway, trusting that the journey meant something even if they couldn't verify its spiritual mechanics. This capacity for faith, for proceeding without certainty, for committing to processes whose outcomes can't be guaranteed, is fundamentally human and fundamentally necessary. We need to be able to act despite uncertainty, to invest ourselves in relationships and projects and beliefs that might fail or disappoint. The pilgrimage modelled this beautifully. People walking for months toward a goal they could never be completely certain was worth reaching, sustained by faith that the journey itself would transform them whether or not the destination lived up to its promises. In our current age of unprecedented access to information and corresponding paralysis in the face of too many choices, the pilgrimage's model of committed action despite uncertainty might be its most valuable lesson. Sometimes we need to simply choose a direction and start walking, trusting that movement itself will reveal meaning that stationary contemplation never could. The medieval pilgrims understood this, and perhaps we need to relearn it. The wisdom of committing fully to a path without requiring certainty that it's the perfect or correct path, knowing that transformation comes through the walking, not through choosing the optimal route. The Camino de Santiago still exists, not as museum piece or archaeological curiosity, but as living phenomenon walked by hundreds of thousands annually. The ancient routes carrying modern pilgrims alongside the ghosts of medieval travellers who walked these same stones centuries ago. The cathedral still stands at Journey's End, welcoming the weary as it has for over 1,000 years. The scallop shells still mark the way, painted on walls and set in pavement, guiding feet along paths worn deep by millions who came before. The pilgrimage endures not because anyone proved the bones were authentic, but because the journey itself offers something humans still need, something that transcends theology and historical accuracy. Walk into the cathedral at Santiago on any day when pilgrims arrive, and you'll witness scenes remarkably similar to what happened in the Middle Ages. Modern backpackers, dusty and exhausted from weeks of walking, entering the vast stone space with expressions of awe and relief, some crying, whether from joy or exhaustion or spiritual experience or simple, overwhelming emotion after completing something difficult. Others sitting in quiet contemplation, too drained for dramatic response. Still others comparing notes with fellow pilgrims, already beginning to process the experience through storytelling, turning raw experience into narrative they can carry home. The daily pilgrim mass at noon maintains traditions centuries old. Pilgrims crowd the pews while the great botafumeiro, an enormous silver incense burner, swings through the cathedral on ropes pulled by 8 men, an elaborate ceremony that dates to at least the 14th century. The ritual serves no practical purpose anymore. In medieval times it masked the smell of thousands of unwashed pilgrims packed into the space. But it continues because pilgrims expect it, because it connects modern walkers to all who came before, because ritual persists long after its original function becomes obsolete. The modern pilgrimage differs from its medieval counterpart in obvious ways. Today's pilgrims carry smartphones instead of prayer books, stay in municipal albergues with hot showers instead of monastery floors, can call for help if they're injured or lost. The journey is safer, more comfortable, more predictable. Bandits don't lurk in mountain passes anymore. Disease is treatable. Food and water are reliable. No one expects to die along the way, and almost no one does. Yet despite these differences, the fundamental experience remains recognizably similar. People still walk 20 or 30 miles per day, feet still blister and muscles still ache. The mental challenges of continuing day after day still test determination. Modern pilgrims still form intense temporary communities with fellow walkers, still experience the same mixture of physical suffering and psychological transformation that medieval pilgrims described. The specific cultural framework has changed. Many modern pilgrims are secular or spiritual but not religious, but the human needs being addressed remain constant. The stones themselves remember, if stones can remember. The paths worn smooth by countless feet, the doorways where millions of hands reached out to touch carved figures for blessing, the steps to the cathedral worn into curves by the weight of all who climbed them. These physical traces of past pilgrims create tangible connection across centuries. A modern walker placing their hand in the worn depression on the Tree of Jesse column, where medieval pilgrims did exactly the same thing, participates in an unbroken tradition spanning nearly 1,000 years. The gesture itself unchanged even as the world around it transformed completely. The hospices continue too, though now most are municipal rather than monastic, run by volunteers rather than monks. The same spirit of hospitality persists, the understanding that walkers need shelter and deserve it regardless of ability to pay. Many albergues operate on donation basis, trusting pilgrims to give what they can, maintaining the medieval principle that those on sacred journey should receive aid. This voluntary system of mutual support, fragile and imperfect but functional, preserves something beautiful about human capacity for generosity towards strangers. The towns along the Camino still depend economically on pilgrims, though now it's tourism rather than spiritual devotion that drives the economy. Restaurants and gear shops, hotels and souvenir vendors all profit from the hundreds of thousands who walk each year. Some long-time residents resent this commercialization, complain that the Camino has become too crowded, too focused on consumption rather than contemplation. Others are grateful for the employment and economic vitality the pilgrimage brings. The tension between sacred and commercial, present since the Middle Ages, continues in modern form. Scholars still debate the historical questions, whether James ever reached Spain, whether those bones beneath the cathedral are authentic, whether the whole thing was pious fraud or genuine discovery. New archaeological techniques, new historical methods occasionally produce fresh evidence or perspectives, but nothing definitive enough to settle the debate conclusively. The uncertainty persists, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the pilgrimage's power requires some uncertainty, some gap between belief and proof that faith must bridge. What seems certain now, looking back across 12 centuries since that hermit saw lights in the Galician hills, is that something profound happened here, something that shaped European civilization in lasting ways. Whether or not an apostle's remains rest in Santiago, the pilgrimage route became a highway for culture, commerce, and ideas. It connected regions that might otherwise have remained isolated. It created shared experiences that helped forge European identity. It offered millions of people a path toward meaning and transformation in lives otherwise constrained by poverty, violence, and limited horizons. The churches still stand, hundreds of Romanesque and Gothic masterpieces built to serve and impress pilgrims, many still functioning as houses of worship, their stones still echoing with prayers in multiple languages. The bridges still span rivers, some the same medieval structures that carried pilgrims centuries ago, others rebuilt but following original paths. The route itself remains visible in landscape and townscape, its influence evident in settlement patterns, architectural styles, place names that preserve pilgrimage associations. Contemporary pilgrims often speak of the Camino as timeless, as stepping out of ordinary time into something ancient and enduring. This isn't quite accurate. The route has changed constantly, adapting to new technologies and social conditions, but the feeling captures something real about the experience. Walking these paths does create connection to the past, does offer encounter with something larger and older than individual lives. The pilgrimage persists precisely because it offers this timelessness, this escape from the relentless presentism of modern life into rhythms and purposes that feel more fundamental. The future of the Camino seems secure, at least for foreseeable future. Pilgrim numbers continue growing, the infrastructure keeps expanding to accommodate them, new routes and variations get established to reduce crowding on the most popular paths. The meaning people find in the journey continues to justify the effort, whether they're seeking spiritual transformation, physical challenge, cultural experience, or simply escape from ordinary life's pressures. The specific reasons may differ from medieval motivations, but the underlying needs remain recognizably human and timeless. And so the journey continues, as it has for over 1,000 years, feet walking westward toward the setting sun and the cathedral at Land's End, each step both unique and part of an endless repetition, each pilgrim both individual and representative of all who came before and all who will come after. The stones know this, worn smooth by the passage of countless feet. The paths know it, etched into landscape by the collective weight of millions walking the same direction toward the same destination. The shells know it, scattered along beaches where medieval pilgrims collected them, and modern walkers still do, symbol persisting across centuries because some truths are too deep for words and require objects to carry them. The Camino endures not despite uncertainty about its origins, but perhaps because of it, the gaps in the historical record leaving space for faith and imagination, for each generation to find in the pilgrimage what they need, rather than being constrained by definitive answers. Whether St. James rest in Galicia matters less than what humans created by believing he did. The beauty and community and transformation generated by millions walking toward what they trusted was sacred, even if they could never prove it absolutely. And perhaps that's the final lesson, the ultimate gift of Santiago pilgrimage to those who walk it, and to those who study its history from comfortable distance. Some truths reveal themselves not through evidence and analysis, but through doing, through committing to the journey without requiring certainty about the destination. The pilgrims understood this, medieval and modern alike, understood that walking matters more than arriving, that faith means proceeding despite doubt, that transformation happens in the steps themselves, rather than in reaching the shrine at journey's end. The Camino waits, as it always has, for those ready to walk it, ready to test themselves against distance and difficulty, ready to find whatever they need to find in the ancient rhythm of feet on stone, in the community of fellow travellers, in the silence of exhausted evenings and the promise of tomorrow's road. The shells mark the way westward, as they have for 1,000 years. The stones remember all who passed, and somewhere ahead, always ahead, The cathedral rises against the sky, calling pilgrims home to a destination that matters less than the journey it took to reach it. Rest well. The road is always there when you're ready to walk it again.